Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we descend deeper into the careful world of police documentation, where every incident becomes a story told in the measured language of official reports. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of these accounts, each one a small monument to the patient work of recording human experience. Close your eyes and drift into the steady flow of documented time. The morning briefing room at the 7th Precinct had that particular quality of light that comes just before sunrise, when the fluorescent fixtures work in harmony with the first pale glow filtering through the windows. Sergeant Patricia Reeves had always preferred this hour, when the overnight reports waited in neat stacks on her desk, each one representing a piece of the city's story that had unfolded while most residents slept. She lifted the first report from the pile, feeling the familiar weight of the standard forms that had been used for decades. The paper was slightly heavier than modern copy paper, designed to withstand the carbon copies that were still standard practice in 1988. The typewriter font had that distinctive character that spoke of careful composition, each letter struck with deliberate precision by officers who understood that their words would become the permanent record of events that might otherwise be lost to memory. Report number 880412 documented a domestic disturbance call on Maple Street, responded to by officers Johnson and Lee at 2:47 a.m. The report began with the standard heading information, typed in neat rows that provided the essential framework for understanding what had followed. Date, time, location, responding officers, complainant name and address, all recorded with the methodical precision that transformed chaos into order. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, aged 34, residing at 1247 Maple Street, had called to report that her neighbor in the adjoining apartment was playing music loudly and appeared to be arguing with someone, though she could not determine whether this someone was present in the apartment or was being addressed through a telephone conversation. The music she had reported was not contemporary, but seemed to be big band music from an earlier era, played at a volume that made sleep impossible for anyone in the neighboring units. Officer Johnson had documented their approach to the building with the kind of detail that painted a complete picture of the scene. The apartment building was a converted Victorian house, divided into 4 units, each accessible through a separate entrance. The building showed signs of careful maintenance, with well-tended flower boxes beneath the windows and a front walkway that was clean and well lit. The music Mrs. Vasquez had described was indeed audible from the street, though Officer Johnson noted that it was not played at a volume that would typically result in a citation. Under the city's noise ordinance, the sound of argument was also audible, though as Mrs. Vasquez had observed, it appeared to be one-sided, suggesting that the resident was indeed speaking to someone through the telephone rather than engaged in a physical altercation with someone present in the apartment. Officer Johnson had knocked on the door, identifying himself and requesting permission to speak with the resident about the noise complaint. The door had been answered by Mr. Harold Kowalski, aged 67, who appeared to be in good health but somewhat agitated. He was dressed in a bathrobe and slippers, and Officer Johnson noted that he seemed surprised by the presence of police officers, as though he had been unaware that his activities were audible to neighbors. Mr. Kowalski had immediately apologized for any disturbance and had invited the officers into his apartment to explain the situation. The apartment, as described in Officer Johnson's report, was neat and clean, but filled with an unusual number of family photographs, many of them quite old and displayed in elaborate frames that suggested they held special significance for Mr. Kowalski. The music that had prompted the complaint was playing on an old phonograph, the kind with a large horn speaker that would have been common several decades earlier. The records scattered around the phonograph were all from the 1940s and 1950s. Big band arrangements that spoke of an earlier era in American popular music. Mr. Kowalski had explained that he had been unable to sleep and had been calling his sister in Chicago, with whom he had been discussing their late mother's belongings. Their mother had passed away 6 months earlier, and they had been working through the difficult process of deciding which family items each sibling would keep and which would be donated or sold. The conversation had become emotional, leading to the raised voices that Mrs. Vasquez had heard through the thin walls of the old building. The music, Mr. Kowalski had explained, was their mother's favorite. Songs she had danced to with their father during the war years when he was home on leave. Playing these records helped him feel connected to her memory, but he realized now that what brought him comfort might be causing distress for his neighbors. He had immediately offered to use headphones for future late-night listening sessions and to limit his phone conversations to reasonable hours. Officer Johnson's report documented the resolution with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his description of the initial problem. He had spoken with Mrs. Vasquez to inform her of Mr. Kowalski's explanation and his willingness to modify his behavior to prevent future disturbances. Mrs. Vasquez had expressed understanding and sympathy for Mr. Kowalski's grief, noting that she had not realized he was dealing with the recent loss of his mother. The report concluded with a follow-up notation indicating that Officer Johnson had checked with Mrs. Vasquez 1 week later to confirm that there had been no further disturbances. She had reported that Mr. Kowalski had stopped by her apartment to personally apologize and to explain more about his mother's death and his struggle with grief. They had discovered a shared interest in gardening, leading to conversations about the small herb garden Mrs. Vasquez maintained on her balcony. Sergeant Reeves found something deeply satisfying about reports like this one. Cases where patient police work had transformed a potential source of ongoing conflict into an opportunity for neighbors to understand and support each other. Officer Johnson's approach had gone beyond simply enforcing noise regulations to address the human needs and emotions that had created the disturbance in the first place. She moved to the next report, number 880413, which documented a shoplifting incident at Morrison's hardware store. Officer Chun had responded to a call from store manager Robert Morrison, who reported that he had observed the customer concealing items in a large purse and attempting to leave the store without paying. The suspect had been detained by store security and was waiting in the office when Officer Chun arrived. The suspect was identified as Mrs. Dorothy Williams, aged 72, who lived alone in a small apartment 3 blocks from the hardware store. Officer Chun's report noted that Mrs. Williams appeared confused and somewhat disoriented, though she was able to provide her name and address when asked. The items she had attempted to steal were small household items, a package of light bulbs, a bottle of household cleaner, and a roll of duct tape. With a total value of less than $15, Mr. Morrison had initially been prepared to press charges, explaining that shoplifting had been an ongoing problem at his store and that he felt it was important to send a clear message that theft would not be tolerated. However, Officer Chun's questioning of Mrs. Williams had revealed circumstances that suggested the situation was more complex than simple criminal intent. Mrs. Williams had explained that she had come to the store to purchase the items, but had become confused about the location of the cash register. She had been looking for someone to help her pay for the items when store security had approached her, at which point her confusion had increased and she had been unable to clearly explain her intentions. She had attempted to show the security guard the money she had brought to pay for the items, but her explanations had been interpreted as efforts to avoid responsibility for the theft. Officer Chun had taken the time to speak with Mrs. Williams privately, conducting what he described as an informal mental status assessment to better understand her level of cognitive function. She had been able to answer questions about her address, phone number, and family members, but had shown some difficulty with short-term memory and had seemed uncertain About the day of the week and the current date, the report documented Officer Chun's conversation with Mrs. Williams' daughter, whom he had contacted using information from Mrs. Williams' identification. The daughter, Mrs. Janet Patterson, had explained that her mother had been showing signs of memory problems for several months but had been resistant to medical evaluation. Mrs. Williams valued her independence and had been reluctant to admit that she might need assistance with daily activities like shopping. Mrs. Patterson had arrived at the hardware store within 30 minutes of Officer Chun's call and had worked with him to resolve the situation in a way that addressed both the store's concerns and Mrs. Williams' needs. Mr. Morrison had agreed to drop any charges when he understood that Mrs. Williams' behavior had been the result of confusion rather than criminal intent. Mrs. Patterson had paid for the items her mother had intended to purchase and had apologized for any inconvenience. The report included a notation that Officer Chun had provided Mrs. Patterson with information about local resources for families dealing with memory-related issues, including support groups and services that could help Mrs. Williams maintain her independence while ensuring her safety. He had also suggested that Mrs. Patterson speak with her mother's doctor about the incidents of confusion and disorientation. A follow-up report, filed 2 weeks later, indicated that Mrs. Williams had begun receiving support from a local senior services organization, which provided assistance with shopping and other daily activities. Mr. Morrison had also implemented new training for his staff to help them recognize when customers might be experiencing confusion or distress rather than attempting to steal merchandise. These reports represented the kind of police work that rarely received public attention, but formed the foundation of community trust and safety. Officer Chun's patient approach had prevented an elderly woman from being criminalized for behavior that was really a symptom of a medical condition, while also addressing the legitimate concerns of a business owner dealing with theft. Sergeant Reeves picked up the next report, number 880414, which documented a more complex incident involving suspected drug activity in Riverside Park. Officers Martinez and Thompson had been conducting routine patrol when they observed what appeared to be a drug transaction taking place near the children's playground. Their report detailed their careful approach to a situation that required balancing law enforcement objectives with community safety concerns. The initial observation had been made at approximately 11:30 p.m., when the park should have been closed to public access. Officers Martinez and Thompson had noticed two individuals meeting near the playground equipment, engaging in what appeared to be an exchange of money and small packages. The behavior pattern was consistent with drug transactions, though the officers noted that their observation point had been too distant to make definitive determinations about the nature of the exchange, rather than immediately intervening. Officers Martinez and Thompson had chosen to observe the situation more carefully, positioning themselves to get a clearer view while avoiding actions that might escalate the situation or endanger bystanders. Their report documented this decision-making process, explaining how they had balanced the need to investigate potential criminal activity with considerations about officer safety and community impact. The individuals involved in the apparent transaction were described as two males, one appearing to be in his early 20s and the other possibly in his late teens. Both were dressed in clothing that suggested they were local residents rather than visitors to the area, and both appeared to be familiar with the park layout, moving through the space as though they had been there many times before. Officer Martinez had approached the individuals, while Officer Thompson had positioned himself to provide backup and to ensure that no one left the scene before the situation could be properly assessed. The approach had been conducted calmly and professionally, with Officer Martinez identifying himself and requesting to speak with both individuals about their presence in the park after closing hours. The older of the two individuals was identified as Michael Santos, age 22, who lived in an apartment complex adjacent to the park. The younger was identified as his brother David Santos, aged 17, who lived in the same household. Both individuals had been cooperative with the officer's questions, though they had initially been reluctant to explain their presence in the park or the nature of their meeting. Martinez's questioning had eventually revealed that Michael Santos had been dealing marijuana to a small group of regular customers, including his younger brother. The business was modest in scale, involving only small quantities of marijuana that Michael purchased from a supplier in another part of the city and resold to friends and acquaintances in his neighborhood. The investigation had proceeded methodically, with both officers working to understand the full scope of the activity while also assessing the potential risks and benefits of different enforcement approaches. Michael Santos had been in possession of approximately 2 ounces of marijuana and a small amount of cash that appeared to represent proceeds from sales. David Santos had purchased a small quantity for personal use, rather than making immediate arrests. Officers Martinez and Thompson had chosen to conduct what their report described as a comprehensive assessment of the situation. They had questioned both individuals about the extent of Michael's dealing operation, the number of people involved as customers, and any connections to larger drug distribution networks. The questioning had revealed that Michael's operation was entirely local and small scale, involving only marijuana and serving primarily young adults in his immediate neighborhood. He had no connections to more serious drug trafficking operations and had never been involved in selling harder drugs or in any activities that involved violence or weapons. Officers Martinez and Thompson had also assessed the community impact of Michael's activities. The park location had been chosen specifically because it was isolated and unlikely to be observed by families with children or other community members who might be disturbed by drug activity. Michael had been careful to conduct his business in ways that minimized visibility and avoided creating any safety concerns for other park users. After consulting with their supervisor by radio, Officers Martinez and Thompson had chosen to handle the situation through what they described as a community-focused intervention rather than traditional criminal prosecution. Michael Santos had been issued a citation for possession of marijuana with intent to distribute, but had also been connected with a job counseling program that could help him find legitimate employment. David Santos had been released with a warning, but both officers had spoken with him extensively about the risks associated with drug use and the potential consequences of being involved in his brother's business. They had also provided information about educational and recreational programs that were available to young people in the neighborhood. The report documented follow-up contacts with both individuals over the following months. Michael Santos had successfully completed the job counseling program and had found employment with a local moving company. He had also ceased his marijuana dealing activities, at least in the park location where he had been apprehended. David Santos had become involved in a basketball league that used the same park during daylight hours, channeling his time and energy into activities that contributed positively to the community. This case exemplified the kind of nuanced police work that characterized many of the reports from this period. Officers Martinez and Thompson had recognized that simply arresting Michael Santos for drug dealing would have done little to address the underlying issues that had led to his involvement in illegal activity, while potentially creating additional barriers to his successful integration into legitimate economic opportunities. Their approach had required careful judgment about the appropriate balance between law enforcement and community development, recognizing that sometimes the most effective police work involved helping people find alternatives to criminal activity rather than simply punishing them for their choices. Sergeant Reeves moved to the next report, number 880415, which documented a breaking and entering incident that had evolved into something quite different from what the initial call had suggested. Officer Rodriguez had responded to a report from Mrs. Catherine Murphy, who had called to report that someone had broken into her deceased husband's workshop and appeared to have been living there without permission. Mrs. Murphy's husband had died 8 months earlier, leaving behind a detached garage that he had converted into a woodworking shop. The space was equipped with tools, a small refrigerator, and a cot that Mr. Murphy had used when working on projects that required multiple days to complete. Mrs. Murphy had not visited the workshop since her husband's death, finding it too emotionally difficult to spend time in the space where he had devoted so many hours to his hobby. The break-in had been discovered when Mrs. Murphy had finally decided to begin the process of cleaning out the workshop, possibly to convert it for storage or to rent it as additional income. When she had unlocked the door, she had found clear signs that someone had been using the space as a temporary residence. The cot had been slept in, food items were stored in the refrigerator, and personal belongings were arranged around the space as though someone had been living there for an extended period. Officer Rodriguez's report described his careful examination of the workshop, documenting the evidence of habitation while also noting that whoever had been using the space had been respectful of Mr. Murphy's tools and equipment. Nothing appeared to have been stolen or damaged, and the intruder had even made efforts to keep the space clean and organized. The presence of cleaning supplies and the general tidiness of the area suggested that this was not a typical breaking and entering case. Mrs. Murphy had been understandably upset by the discovery, not only because someone had been using her property without permission, but also because the workshop represented a shrine to her husband's memory that she had not been ready to disturb. The presence of a stranger in this sacred space felt like a violation of her grief process and her husband's legacy. Officer Rodriguez had begun his investigation by examining the method of entry, which had involved forcing open a window rather than breaking the lock on the main door. The damage was minimal, suggesting that the intruder had tried to avoid causing unnecessary destruction while gaining access to the space. Inside the workshop, Officer Rodriguez had found personal items that provided clues about the identity of the person who had been living there. The belongings included work clothes, toiletries, and a small notebook containing what appeared to be job search information and addresses of local social service agencies. There were also letters addressed to someone named James Mitchell, providing Officer Rodriguez with a name to investigate. The letters were from family members in another state, expressing concern about James's unemployment and encouraging him to come home rather than trying to make it on his own in a city where he had no established support network. Officer Rodriguez had taken the time to research James Mitchell through police records and social service databases, discovering that he was a 28-year-old veteran who had been struggling with unemployment and homelessness since being discharged from the military 6 months earlier. He had no criminal record beyond minor violations related to sleeping in public spaces, and social workers who had encountered him described him as polite and respectful, someone who was trying to get back on his feet, but was facing barriers that made stable housing difficult to achieve, rather than simply waiting for James to return to the workshop and then arresting him for breaking and entering. Officer Rodriguez had worked with Mrs. Murphy to understand her concerns and to explore options that might address both her rights as a property owner and James's obvious need for shelter. This conversation had revealed that Mrs. Murphy was not primarily motivated by a desire to see James punished, but rather by her need to feel that her husband's memory was being respected and that her property was secure. Officer Rodriguez had suggested a meeting between Mrs. Murphy and James, facilitated by a social worker and conducted in a neutral location. To discuss the situation and explore possible solutions, Mrs. Murphy had initially been reluctant, but had agreed when Officer Rodriguez explained James's military service and his efforts to find employment despite challenging circumstances. The meeting had taken place at the office of a local veterans service organization, with Officer Rodriguez present along with a social worker who specialized in helping homeless veterans. James had been deeply apologetic about using Mrs. Murphy's workshop without permission, explaining that he had chosen the location because it was clean and secure but not obviously occupied, and because he had tried to be respectful of the tools and equipment that clearly belonged to someone who cared about craftsmanship. James had explained that he had been sleeping in shelters and public spaces since his discharge from the military, but had been having difficulty finding stable housing because of requirements for security deposits and references that were challenging for someone without established employment. He had heard about job opportunities in construction and manufacturing in Mrs. Murphy's neighborhood, and had been using the workshop as a base while attending job interviews and trying to save enough money for an apartment. Mrs. Murphy had been moved by James's story and by his obvious respect for her husband's tools and workspace. She had learned that James had some experience with woodworking from his military service, and had noticed that he had actually made some minor repairs to equipment in the workshop that had been damaged before her husband's death. The resolution that emerged from this meeting had been creative and mutually beneficial. Mrs. Murphy had offered to allow James to continue using the workshop in exchange for helping her complete some home maintenance projects that she had been unable to tackle since her husband's death. This arrangement would provide James with stable housing while he continued his job search, while also giving Mrs. Murphy assistance with tasks that had been overwhelming for her to handle alone. Officer Rodriguez's final report documented the formal agreement that had been reached between Mrs. Murphy and James. With the assistance of the Veterans Service Organization, James would be able to use the workshop as temporary housing for up to 6 months, during which time he would help Mrs. Murphy with home repairs and maintenance in lieu of rent. The Veterans Service Organization would provide ongoing support to help James find permanent employment and housing, while also serving as a mediator if any conflicts arose between Mrs. Murphy and James. A follow-up report filed 3 months later indicated that the arrangement had been successful for both parties. James had found employment with a local construction company and was saving money toward his own apartment. Mrs. Murphy had reported that having James's help with home maintenance had been enormously beneficial, and that his presence in the workshop had actually made the space feel less like a shrine and more like a living part of her property again. Case had concluded with James moving into his own apartment and Mrs. Murphy deciding to rent the workshop to another veteran who was recommended by the same service organization that had helped James. Officer Rodriguez noted that what had begun as a simple breaking and entering case had evolved into a model for how communities could address both property crime and homelessness through creative problem solving rather than traditional criminal justice approaches. These reports painted a picture of police work that went far beyond simple law enforcement to encompass mediation, social work, and community development. Officer Rodriguez's patient approach had transformed a potential criminal case into an opportunity for two people to help each other while addressing underlying social problems that contributed to both property crime and homelessness. Sergeant Reeves continued through the stack of reports, each one representing a different facet of the complex work that police officers performed in maintaining community safety and order. Report 880416 documented a traffic accident that had required extensive investigation. to determine liability and ensure that all parties received appropriate assistance. The accident had occurred at the intersection of Oak Street and 3rd Avenue, involving 2 vehicles and resulting in minor injuries to 3 people. Officer Davis had responded to the call, arriving to find a situation that was more complex than typical traffic accidents because of questions about traffic, signal timing and visibility that required careful documentation and analysis. The first vehicle, driven by Mrs. Sarah Kim, had been traveling north on Oak Street when it collided with a second vehicle, driven by Mr. Robert Jackson, who had been traveling east on 3rd Avenue. Both drivers claimed to have had a green light at the time of the collision, suggesting either a malfunction in the traffic signal system or confusion about the timing of the signal changes. Officer Davis's report documented his systematic approach to investigating the accident, beginning with interviews of both drivers and any available witnesses, followed by careful examination of the physical evidence at the scene, and concluding with analysis of the traffic signal system to determine whether mechanical problems might have contributed to the collision. Mrs. Kim had explained that she had been driving to her job at the local hospital, following a route she traveled twice daily and was completely familiar with. She had approached the intersection as the light changed from red to green, had checked for any traffic that might be running the red light, and had proceeded through the intersection at a normal speed. The collision had occurred when she was approximately halfway through the intersection. Mr. Jackson had provided a similar account, explaining that he had been driving to an early morning appointment and had approached the intersection as his light changed from red to green. He had also checked for traffic before proceeding, had seen no vehicles approaching on Oak Street, and had entered the intersection expecting clear passage. The collision had occurred when Mrs. Kim's vehicle had struck the passenger side of his car. Officer Davis had interviewed 3 witnesses who had observed the accident from different vantage points. The first witness, Mrs. Dorothy Chun, had been walking her dog along Oak Street and had seen Mrs. Kim's vehicle approaching the intersection. She had observed the traffic light change from red to green for north-south traffic just before Mrs. Kim entered the intersection. The second witness, Mr. Frank Rodriguez, had been waiting at a bus stop on 3rd Avenue and had observed Mr. Jackson's approach to the intersection. He had seen the light change from red to green for east-west traffic just before Mr. Jackson entered the intersection. His account corroborated Mr. Jackson's claim that he had a green light when he proceeded through the intersection. The third witness, Mrs. Helen Thompson, had been in her apartment overlooking the intersection and had observed the accident from above. Her account provided a different perspective that helped Officer Davis understand the sequence of events. She had seen both lights change to green simultaneously, creating a situation where both drivers legitimately believed they had the right of way. Officer Davis's investigation of the traffic signal system had revealed that there had indeed been a malfunction in the timing mechanism that controlled the intersection. The signal had experienced what technicians described as a timing overlap, where both directions received green lights for approximately 3 seconds before the system automatically corrected itself and returned to normal operation. This malfunction had been the direct cause of the accident, as both drivers had been following traffic laws and exercising appropriate caution when they entered the intersection. Officer Davis's report documented his coordination with city traffic engineers to ensure that the malfunction was repaired and that similar problems were prevented in the future. The investigation had also revealed that this intersection had been the site of several similar accidents over the past year, suggesting that timing problems had been occurring intermittently for some time. Officer Davis had recommended a comprehensive evaluation of the traffic signal system throughout the city to identify and correct similar problems before they caused additional accidents. His report documented the assistance provided to all parties involved in the accident, including coordination with emergency medical services to ensure that the 3 people who had suffered minor injuries received appropriate care. He had also worked with insurance companies to ensure that the investigation results were properly documented for claims processing. The case had been resolved with no citations issued to either driver, as both had been following traffic laws at the time of the accident. The city had accepted responsibility for the signal malfunction and had covered the costs of vehicle repairs and medical treatment for all parties involved. Officer Davis had also worked with both drivers to ensure they had access to resources for dealing with any emotional trauma associated with the accident. These detailed accident reports represented another facet of police work that required patience, analytical skills, and attention to detail. Officer Davis's thorough investigation had not only determined the cause of this particular accident, but had also identified systemic problems that could prevent future accidents from occurring. Sergeant Reeves picked up the next report, number 880417, which documented a domestic dispute that had required multiple visits and careful coordination with social service agencies to resolve safely. Officer Williams had initially responded to a call from neighbors who reported hearing loud arguments and what sounded like furniture being thrown in an apartment on Elm Street. The initial report described Officer Williams's approach to what could have been a dangerous situation, documenting the careful procedures he had followed to assess the level of risk and determine the appropriate response. Domestic disputes were always challenging because they involved people in highly emotional states, often with complex histories of conflict that could not be resolved through simple police intervention. Officer Williams had arrived at the apartment building to find that the arguing had stopped, but he could hear quiet conversation coming from the apartment in question. He had knocked on the door and identified himself, requesting permission to speak with the residents about the noise complaint from neighbors at the door had been answered by Ms. Jennifer Martinez, age 26, who appeared upset but not injured. She had initially been reluctant to allow Officer Williams into the apartment, explaining that she and her boyfriend had been having a disagreement, but that the situation was under control and did not require police intervention. Officer Williams's report documented his patient efforts to assess the situation and ensure that Ms. Martinez was safe. He had explained that neighbors had been concerned about the level of noise and had asked to speak with both residents to make sure everyone was okay. Ms. Martinez had eventually agreed to let him into the apartment, where he had met her boyfriend, Mr. David Chun, age 28. The apartment showed signs of the argument that neighbors had reported, with a lamp knocked over and some papers scattered on the floor. But there were no signs of physical violence or property damage that would suggest the situation had escalated beyond a verbal disagreement. Both residents appeared to be uninjured, though both were obviously upset and stressed. Officer Williams had spoken with each person separately to understand the nature of their disagreement and to assess whether there were any safety concerns that required immediate intervention. Ms. Martinez had explained that she and Mr. Chun had been arguing about money, specifically about Mr. Chun's recent job loss and their ability to continue paying rent on their apartment. Mr. Chun had been laid off from his job at a local manufacturing plant 2 weeks earlier, part of a general downsizing that had affected numerous employees. The couple had been struggling to adjust to the loss of income while Mr. Chun searched for new employment, and the stress had been creating increasing tension in their relationship. Argument that had prompted the noise complaint had begun when Ms. Martinez had suggested that they might need to consider moving to a less expensive apartment if Mr. Chun could not find new employment quickly. Mr. Chun had interpreted this as criticism, of his efforts to find work and had become defensive, leading to an escalating argument that had included raised voices and Mr. Chun knocking over the lamp in a gesture of frustration. Officer Williams's report documented his assessment that while the situation was stressful for both parties, there were no indications of domestic violence or immediate safety concerns. However, he had also recognized that the underlying stresses creating conflict between Ms. Martinez and Mr. Chun were likely to continue unless they received assistance in addressing the practical problems they were facing. Rather than simply leaving after determining that no crime had been committed, Officer Williams had spent time discussing resources that might help the couple address their employment and financial difficulties. He had provided information about job placement services, financial counseling programs, and emergency assistance that might help them maintain their housing while Mr. Chun searched for new employment. He had also discussed conflict resolution strategies that might help Ms. Martinez and Mr. Chun communicate about their stresses without allowing disagreements to escalate to levels that disturbed neighbors or created risks for their relationship. This had included practical suggestions about scheduling regular times to discuss financial concerns rather than allowing anxiety to build up until it exploded into arguments. Officer Williams's report included documentation of his follow-up contact with the couple 1 week later. Mr. Chun had registered with a job placement service and had attended a workshop on interviewing. Ms. Martinez had contacted a financial counselor who had helped them develop a budget that would allow them to maintain their apartment for several more months while Mr. Chun continued his job search. The couple had also reported that they were communicating better about their stresses and concerns, using some of the strategies that Officer Williams had suggested to address problems before they became overwhelming. There had been no further noise complaints from neighbors, and both residents had expressed appreciation for Officer Williams's patient approach to their situation. Final follow-up report indicated that Mr. Chun had found new employment within a month of the initial incident, allowing the couple to stabilize their financial situation and resolve the underlying stresses that had been creating conflict in their relationship. The case represented another example of how effective police work often involved addressing the root causes of problems rather than simply responding to their immediate symptoms. These reports continued to reveal the complex nature of police work in maintaining community safety and order. Officers like Williams, Rodriguez, Davis, and others whose work was documented in these files had understood that their job required not only law enforcement skills, but also counseling, mediation, and social work capabilities that allowed them to address the full range of human problems that came to police attention. Sergeant Reeves found herself deeply impressed by the patience, creativity, and genuine care that characterized so much of the police work documented in these reports. Each case represented a small but significant contribution to the ongoing effort to maintain the social fabric that made community life possible. Work that was performed quietly and without recognition, but that formed the foundation of public safety and trust. The morning light had grown stronger while she read through the reports, and she could hear the sounds of the day shift beginning to arrive for work. But the stories contained in these documents would remain carefully preserved records of the patient, thoughtful police work that had helped countless individuals and families navigate the challenges of daily life in a complex urban environment. These reports were more than just documentation of police activities. They were testimonies to the fundamental human skills of empathy, patience, and creative problem-solving that transformed law enforcement from simple rule enforcement into genuine community service. Each carefully typed page represented hours of thoughtful work by Officers who understood that their job was not just to arrest criminals, but to help people find ways to live together peacefully and safely. The stack of reports continued, each one offering another window into the complex world of community policing, where every call represented not just an incident to be resolved, but an opportunity to strengthen the bonds that held the community together. In the careful language of official documentation, these reports preserve the daily miracles of human beings helping each other navigate the challenges of modern life with dignity and respect. Asterisk. The basement archive stretched beyond what any single person could explore in a lifetime. Corridor after corridor of filing systems that had accumulated over decades of careful documentation. Detective Margaret Foster had been assigned to the Records Division for 6 months now. A temporary position that had become something approaching a calling as she discovered the vast landscape of stories waiting in the dim-lit rows. Today she found herself in Section K, where cases from the early 1980s rested in their manila folders, each one tagged with the particular attention to detail that characterized police work from that era. The air here carried that distinct scent of old paper and metal filing cabinets, a smell that had become as familiar to her as coffee or rain. She moved slowly between the rows, her footsteps muffled by the industrial carpeting that had been installed sometime in the 1970s and had absorbed decades of quiet movement through these spaces. Cabinet K47 drew her attention, its metal surface bearing the small scratches and dents that spoke of years of regular use. Inside, she found files from the autumn of 1983, a season that had brought its own particular set of challenges to the police department. The folders were arranged chronologically, each one representing a day or week in the ongoing effort to maintain order and safety in a city that never quite settled into complete predictability. She pulled the first file, numbered 831847, which contained reports about what had been classified as a series of suspicious incidents in the Riverside district. Reading through the initial report, Detective Foster found herself drawn into the methodical way that Officer Janet Morrison had documented a pattern of behavior that had initially seemed random, but had gradually revealed itself as something more intentional. Incidents had begun in September, when residents of Riverside had started reporting that personal items were disappearing from their yards and porches. Not valuable items that might attract typical thieves, but small, seemingly worthless objects, garden tools, children's toys left outside, decorative items that held more sentimental than monetary value. The reports had been filed separately, each one treated as a minor theft that barely warranted investigation. Officer Morrison had been the first to notice that these seemingly unrelated incidents might actually be connected. Her careful review of the individual reports had revealed a geographic pattern, with the thefts occurring in a rough spiral that moved gradually outward from the center of the Riverside district. More importantly, she had noticed that the items being taken shared certain characteristics that suggested they were being selected according to criteria that had nothing to do with their resale value. The stolen items included a small ceramic gnome from Mrs. Patterson's garden, a painted birdhouse that belonged to the Johnson family, a wind chime from the Martinez household, and a collection of smooth stones that 8-year-old Timothy Walsh had arranged along his family's front walkway. Each item was distinctive, colorful, or somehow special within its environment, suggesting that the thief was choosing objects based on aesthetic rather than economic considerations. Officer Morrison's investigation had proceeded with the kind of patience that characterized much of the police work from that era. Rather than waiting for more thefts to occur, she had begun walking through the Riverside district during different times of day, observing the rhythm of the neighborhood and trying to understand what might make certain items attractive to someone who was clearly not motivated by typical criminal considerations. Her reports documented These walking patrols with careful attention to detail, describing the layout of the neighborhood, the daily patterns of residents, and the seasonal changes that were occurring as autumn progressed. She had noted which houses had the most appealing yard decorations, which families spent the most time outside, and which areas of the neighborhood seemed most conducive to the kind of quiet observation that would be necessary for selecting items to steal. The breakthrough in the case had come not through dramatic detective work but through what Officer Morrison described as patient observation and community engagement. During one of her walking patrols, she had encountered Mrs. Dorothy Kim, an elderly woman who spent considerable time tending to her garden and watching the street from her front porch. Mrs. Kim had mentioned that she had noticed a young person walking through the neighborhood regularly, always alone, always moving slowly as though examining the houses and yards. Carefully. Mrs. Kim's description had provided Officer Morrison with a more specific focus for her investigation. The person Mrs. Kim had observed was apparently a teenager, probably female, who walked through the neighborhood during after-school hours and seemed particularly interested in yards that contained colorful or artistic decorations. She had been seen on multiple occasions, always carrying a large canvas bag that could have been used to carry stolen items. Officer Morrison had adjusted her patrol schedule to correspond with the times when Mrs. Kim had observed this suspicious figure. Her reports documented several weeks of what she called coincidental presence in the neighborhood, positioning herself to observe normal activities without creating an obvious police presence that might alter the behavior patterns she was trying to understand. Eventual contact had occurred on a gray October afternoon when Officer Morrison had observed a teenage girl examining the yard decorations at the Henderson house with what appeared to be more than casual interest. The girl had been carrying a large canvas bag and had seemed to be assessing the small decorative items that Mrs. Henderson had arranged around her. Flower garden. Officer Morrison had approached the girl calmly, identifying herself and asking if she could speak with her about some recent thefts in the neighborhood. The girl, who identified herself as Lisa Chun, aged 16, had immediately begun crying and had admitted to taking the items that residents had reported missing. Her explanation for the thefts had been unlike anything Officer Morrison had encountered in her police career. Lisa had explained that she was an art student at the local high school, working on a project that involved creating what she called found object sculptures from items that represented different aspects of community life. She had been taking the decorative items not to sell them or to keep them for personal use, but to incorporate them into art pieces that she intended to display at the school's winter art show. The project, as Lisa had described it, was intended to explore themes of community identity and shared aesthetic values. Each stolen item was being used as a component in a larger sculpture that would represent the collective creative spirit of the Riverside district. She had thought that by taking small items from many different households, she was creating something that would celebrate rather than exploit the community that had inspired her work. Officer Morrison's report documented her careful questioning of Lisa about the project and her efforts to understand both the artistic motivations and the practical implications of what Lisa had been doing. Lisa had shown Officer Morrison sketches of the sculptures she was creating, elaborate constructions that combined the stolen items with materials she had purchased or found in other ways. The sculptures were indeed artistic and thoughtful, incorporating each stolen item in ways that seemed to honor its original context while creating new meanings through juxtaposition and combination. Lisa had kept careful notes about where each item had come from, and had actually been planning to return everything to its original owners after the art show had concluded. The resolution of the case had required what Officer Morrison described as a careful balance between law enforcement and community education. Lisa had clearly committed theft, regardless of her artistic intentions, and the residents of Riverside had a right to have their property returned and to feel secure in their homes. However, Lisa's motivations had been benign, and her artistic vision had shown genuine appreciation for the community she had been inadvertently victimizing. Asterisk. Officer Morrison had worked with Lisa and her parents to develop a solution that addressed both the legal issues and the underlying misunderstanding about community property and artistic expression. Lisa had been required to return all stolen items to their original owners, along with personal apologies explaining her project and her recognition that she should have asked permission before taking anything. More importantly, Officer Morrison had worked with the high school art teacher and several Riverside residents to transform Lisa's project into a legitimate community art collaboration. The residents who had lost items were invited to contribute materials voluntarily to a revised version of Lisa's sculpture project, creating an artwork that truly represented community participation rather than community exploitation. The final report in the file documented the success of this collaborative approach. Lisa's revised sculptures had been displayed at the school art show with explanatory materials that described how the project had evolved from individual theft to community collaboration. Several Riverside residents had attended the show and had expressed pride in being part of an artistic project that celebrated their neighborhood's identity. Detective Foster found something deeply moving about this case. The way that Officer Morrison's patient investigation had revealed that what appeared to be simple theft was actually a misguided but sincere attempt at artistic expression. The resolution had required creativity and empathy rather than just law enforcement, transforming a potential criminal case into an opportunity for community building and education. She moved to the next file, numbered 831848, which dealt with what had been reported as vandalism at the old Carnegie Library building. The building had been closed for renovations for several months, and security guards had reported that someone had been entering the building at night and creating what appeared to be elaborate graffiti throughout the interior spaces. Officer Thomas Rodriguez had been assigned to investigate the vandalism, beginning with what seemed like a straightforward case of property destruction that would require identifying and prosecuting the person responsible for defacing a historic public building. However, his initial examination of the vandalism had revealed something unexpected that had transformed his approach to the investigation. The graffiti, as documented in Officer Rodriguez's detailed photographs, was not the typical tagging or random destruction that characterized most vandalism cases. Instead, someone had been creating elaborate murals throughout the library, artwork that incorporated the existing architectural features of the building and seemed designed to enhance rather than deface the historic spaces. The murals depicted scenes from local history, rendered in a style that combined traditional artistic techniques with contemporary urban art forms. The unknown artist had used the library's reading rooms as canvases for large-scale works that told the story of the city's development, incorporating images of the library itself as it had appeared in different eras of its operation. Officer Rodriguez's investigation had proceeded with unusual care, as he attempted to balance his responsibility to protect public property with his recognition that the vandalism represented significant artistic achievement. His reports documented his efforts to understand both the technical aspects of how the murals had been created and the historical research that had clearly gone into planning the content of the artwork. The security system at the Taza library had recorded multiple instances of unauthorized entry over a period of 6 weeks, always during late-night hours when the building was empty of construction workers and other authorized personnel. The entries had been accomplished by someone with considerable knowledge of the building's layout and security systems, suggesting either an inside connection or extensive reconnaissance work. Officer Rodriguez had worked with the library director and the construction foreman to understand who might have had access to information about the building's security systems and renovation schedule. This investigation had revealed that the renovation project had involved dozens of workers, architects, and consultants who had legitimate reasons to be familiar with the building's layout and security arrangements. The breakthrough in the case had come when Officer Rodriguez had noticed that the murals included historical details that could only have been obtained through extensive research in the library's special collections, archives that were not generally accessible to the public, and that contained unique documents about the city's early development. This suggested that the vandal was either a professional historian or someone with specialized knowledge of the library's research collections. Working with the library director, Officer Rodriguez had developed a list of people who had both the knowledge necessary to create historically accurate murals and the familiarity with the building that would enable unauthorized access. This list had included several graduate students who had been working on local history projects, a few professional artists who had previously created public murals, and a small number of library employees who had expertise in local history. The investigation had eventually led to Dr. Patricia Williams, a 34-year-old art history professor at the local university, who had been conducting research for a book about the architectural history of public buildings in the city. Dr. Williams had been visiting the library regularly for several years, had developed close relationships with several staff members, and had been given special access to archives that contained the historical materials referenced in the murals. Officer Rodriguez's interview with Dr. Williams had revealed a complex situation that challenged simple categories of criminal behavior. Dr. Williams had indeed been creating the murals, working at night to avoid interfering with the renovation project, and to ensure that her work would not be damaged by ongoing construction activities. Her motivation for creating the murals had been a combination of artistic expression and historical preservation. Dr. Williams had learned that the renovation project would involve significant changes to the interior spaces of the library, potentially destroying or obscuring architectural details that had historical significance. She had conceived the murals as a way of documenting and celebrating the building's history before these changes. OCCURRED. Dr. Williams had also hoped that the murals would demonstrate the potential for incorporating public art into the renovated library, showing how contemporary artistic expression could enhance rather than compete with historic architecture. She had been planning to reveal her work to library officials once the renovation was complete, hoping that the quality and historical accuracy of the murals would lead to their preservation as permanent installations. Officer Rodriguez's report documented his careful consideration of how to balance Dr. Williams's legitimate artistic and historical motivations with the legal requirements for protecting public property. While Dr. Williams had clearly committed trespassing and vandalism, her work had actually enhanced rather than damaged the library, and her intentions had benefit rather than harm the institution. The resolution had involved extensive consultation between Officer Rodriguez, library officials, university administrators, and city attorneys. Dr. Williams had been charged with trespassing but had been given the opportunity to perform community service related to her expertise in art history rather than serving jail time or paying significant fines. More importantly, the library board had decided to incorporate Dr. Williams's murals into the renovation project, working with professional conservators to ensure that the artwork was properly preserved and integrated into the building's design. Dr. Williams had been hired as a consultant for this preservation work, transforming her unauthorized art project into a legitimate contribution to the community's cultural heritage. The final documentation in the file included photographs of the completed renovation, showing how Dr. Williams's murals had been preserved and enhanced as permanent features of the library's interior. The artwork had become a popular attraction that drew visitors from throughout the region, generating positive publicity for both the library and the city's commitment to supporting public art. Detective Foster continued through the files, each one revealing another facet of the complex relationship between individual expression and community standards that police officers were often called upon to mediate. File 831849 dealt with what had been reported as a series of mysterious disturbances at the Riverside Cemetery, where groundskeepers had been finding evidence that someone was visiting the cemetery at night and apparently conducting some kind of ritual activities. The disturbances had been subtle but persistent. Flowers arranged in patterns that differed from how they had been left by mourners, small objects placed on certain grave sites, and evidence that someone had been sitting or kneeling at particular locations for extended periods. The cemetery director had been concerned about both the potential for vandalism and the possibility that the nocturnal activities might disturb families who came to visit graves during regular hours. Officer Sarah Kim had been assigned to investigate the disturbances, beginning with what seemed like a case of possible grave robbing or satanic activity that might require immediate intervention to protect both the cemetery and the community. However, her initial investigation had revealed that the mysterious activities were more benign than they had initially appeared. The evidence of nocturnal visits was concentrated around a section of the cemetery where veterans from World War II and the Korean War were buried. The objects being left at grave sites were small American flags, flowers, and personal mementos that suggested someone was paying respects rather than engaging in destructive or occult activities. Officer Kim's investigation had included interviews with cemetery staff and regular visitors who might have observed the mysterious activities or noticed anyone who seemed particularly interested in the veterans section. These interviews had revealed that several people had seen a middle-aged man visiting the cemetery during evening hours, always alone, always moving quietly among the veterans' graves. The man had been described as well-dressed and respectful, someone who seemed to be conducting private memorial services rather than engaging in any kind of destructive behavior. Cemetery staff had noted that the areas where he had been observed were actually cleaner and better maintained after his visits, suggesting that he was contributing to rather than detracting from the cemetery's upkeep. Officer Kim had decided to visit the cemetery during the evening hours when the mysterious visitor was most likely to appear, positioning herself to observe without interfering with whatever activities were taking place. Her reports documented several evenings of patient observation before she finally encountered the person who had been conducting the nocturnal visits. The visitor was identified as Mr. Harold Patterson, a 67-year-old veteran who had served in Korea and had been struggling with what his family described as survivor guilt related to friends he had lost during his military service. Mr. Patterson had been visiting the graves of local veterans who had died in the wars he had survived, conducting private memorial services that helped him process his emotions about his wartime experiences. Mr. Patterson's nocturnal visits had been motivated by his desire to honor fallen comrades without drawing attention to himself or his emotional struggles. He had been arranging flowers, leaving small flags, and spending time in quiet reflection at the graves of men he had never known personally, but whose service had connected them across the boundaries of individual experience. Officer Kim's conversation with Mr. Patterson had revealed the depth of his commitment to honoring veterans and his concern about being misunderstood if his activities were discovered. He had been visiting the cemetery at night because he felt more comfortable conducting his private memorial services away from the observation of other visitors who might not understand his emotional connection to the graves of strangers. The resolution of the case had involved working with both Mr. Patterson and cemetery officials to find a way for his memorial activities to continue without creating concerns about unauthorized access or mysterious disturbances. Officer Kim had helped arrange for Mr. Patterson to volunteer with the cemetery's Veterans Memorial Committee, giving him official recognition for his desire to honor military service members. Mr. Patterson had been given keys to the cemetery and official permission to conduct his memorial activities, transforming what had appeared to be mysterious disturbances into a legitimate and valued contribution to the community's recognition of veteran service. His knowledge of military history and his dedication to honoring fallen service members had made him an invaluable addition to the cemetery's volunteer staff. The case had concluded with Mr. Patterson organizing regular memorial services for veterans. Buried in the cemetery, events that drew families and community members together to honor military service and remember the sacrifices that had been made for freedom and security. Officer Kim's patient investigation had transformed a potential security concern into an opportunity for community building and veterans recognition. These files continued to reveal the complex nature of police work that went beyond simple law enforcement to encompass social work, community mediation, and cultural preservation. Detective Foster found herself increasingly impressed by the thoughtfulness and creativity that officers from this era had brought to their work. Their willingness to look beyond surface appearances to understand the human motivations that drove behavior that might initially seem problematic or criminal. File 831850 documented an investigation into what had been reported as a series of break-ins at the old Riverside Elementary School, which had been closed for several years and was scheduled for demolition. Security guards had reported evidence that someone had been entering the building regularly, but nothing appeared to have been stolen, and there were no signs of the kind of vandalism that typically accompanied unauthorized entry into abandoned buildings. Officer Michael Chun had been assigned to investigate the break-ins, beginning with what seemed like a straightforward case of trespassing that might escalate into more serious property damage if not addressed quickly. However, his examination of the building had revealed that the unauthorized entries were actually preserving rather than threatening the historic structure. The person entering the building had been cleaning and maintaining areas that were in danger of deterioration, removing graffiti that had been left by previous intruders, and even making minor repairs to windows and doors that had been damaged by weather or vandalism. The activity suggested someone with knowledge of building maintenance and a genuine concern for preserving the school's historic character. Officer Chun's investigation had included research into the history of Riverside Elementary and interviews with former teachers and community members who had been associated with the school during its years of operation. This research had revealed that the school had been an important community institution for more than 50 years, serving several generations of local families and hosting numerous community events that had helped define the identity of the Riverside district. The investigation had eventually led to Mrs. Catherine Martinez, a 58-year-old former teacher who had worked at Riverside Elementary for 30 years before the school had been closed due to declining enrollment. Mrs. Martinez had been devastated by the decision to demolish the building and had been entering the school to preserve items and memories that would be lost when the demolition occurred. Mrs. Martinez had been collecting photographs, documents, and small artifacts that told the story of the school's history, carefully cataloging items that might be of interest to former students and teachers who wanted to preserve memories of their time at Riverside Elementary. She had also been maintaining the building in hopes that community pressure might eventually lead to its preservation rather than demolition. Officer Chun's interview with Mrs. Martinez had revealed her deep emotional connection to the school and her expertise in both its history and its physical maintenance. She had been the unofficial historian of Riverside Elementary during her teaching career, organizing anniversary celebrations and maintaining photo albums that documented decades of student activities and Community events. The resolution of the case had involved working with Mrs. Martinez, school district officials, and community leaders to find a legal way for her preservation activities to continue. Officer Chun had helped arrange for Mrs. Martinez to be given official permission to enter the building and remove items of historical significance before the demolition occurred. More importantly, Mrs. Martinez's efforts had inspired a broader community movement to preserve the history of Riverside Elementary, even if the building itself could not be saved. The school district had agreed to delay demolition long enough for volunteers to conduct a thorough historical documentation project, creating a permanent record of the school's contribution to community life. Mrs. Martinez had been appointed as the coordinator of this documentation project, working with former teachers, students, and community members to create an archive that would preserve the memory of Riverside Elementary for future generations. The project had included oral history interviews, photographic documentation, and the preservation of artifacts that would be displayed in a memorial exhibit at the current elementary school that served the Riverside district. The case had concluded with a community ceremony that celebrated the history of Riverside Elementary and recognized Mrs. Martinez's dedication to preserving its memory. Officer Chun's patient investigation had transformed what appeared to be simple trespassing into an opportunity for community healing and historical preservation, allowing people to say goodbye to an important institution in a way that honored its contribution to their lives. These archives continued to reveal stories of human complexity and community connection that challenged simple categories of criminal and legal behavior. Detective Foster found herself moved by the dedication that officers like Kim, Chun, Rodriguez, and others had shown to understanding the human motivations that drove behavior that might initially appear problematic or illegal. The files in Section K represented just a small fraction of the vast archive that surrounded her, each cabinet containing similar stories of patient police work that had helped individuals and communities navigate the challenges of modern life. The dust and silence of the archives held these stories with quiet dignity, preserving the memory of work that was often unrecognized, but that formed the foundation of community trust and safety. As afternoon light filtered through the small windows that provided the only natural illumination in the archives, Detective Foster found herself thinking about the continuity between the work documented in these old files and the police work being done in the present day. The specific technologies and procedures had changed, but the fundamental human challenges that police officers were called upon to address remained remarkably consistent across the decades. The patient, thoughtful approaches documented in these files offered lessons that were as relevant today as they had been in the 1980s. Reminders that effective police work often required understanding people as complex human beings, rather than simply as violators of laws or threats to public order. The archives preserved not just the documentation of individual cases, but the accumulated wisdom of officers who had learned through experience how to balance law enforcement with community service, how to address immediate problems while also working toward long-term solutions. Section K stretched beyond what she could explore in a single day. And beyond Section K lay dozens of other sections, each one containing its own collection of stories that spoke to the complexity and humanity of police work. The archives represented more than just storage for old case files. They were a library of human experience, a repository of lessons learned through patient attention to the endless variety of situations that brought people into contact with law enforcement. Detective Foster closed the last file and returned it to its proper place in the cabinet, ensuring that it was positioned exactly as she had found it. These stories deserved that kind of care, that attention to preservation that would allow future officers to discover them and learn from the wisdom they contained. The archives would be here tomorrow and the day after that, holding their stories with quiet dignity, waiting for the next reader who needed to understand that police work, at its best, was really about helping people find ways to live together with mutual respect and understanding. The silence of the archives was not empty, but full, filled with the accumulated voices of officers and citizens who had worked together to create communities where safety and freedom could coexist, where individual expression could be balanced with collective responsibility, where human complexity could be acknowledged and addressed with patience and creativity. In the dust and stillness of these forgotten corridors, the essential work of civilization continued its quiet preservation, waiting to inspire future generations of officers who would face similar challenges, with the same dedication to understanding and serving the communities they were sworn to protect. The old courthouse on 5th Street had been constructed in 1923, when architects still believed that public buildings should inspire reverence through their very presence. Its corridors stretched wide enough for crowds to gather. Yet on most evenings, like this one in the autumn of 1985, they held only the sound of a single guard's footsteps echoing against marble floors that had been polished smooth by decades of careful maintenance. Security guard Robert Shun made his rounds with the methodical precision that had characterized his work for the past 12 years. Each evening, after the judges had gone home and the clerks had locked their offices, he became the sole guardian of this temple of justice, walking through courtrooms where thousands of cases had been heard and decided, where the daily drama of law enforcement found its resolution in the careful application of legal principle to human complexity. Main courtroom on the 2nd floor retained the grandeur that its original designers had intended, with high ceilings that seemed to lift conversations towards something approaching the sacred, and wooden benches that had been worn smooth by the countless people who had sat waiting for their cases to be called. During the day, this room buzzed with activity as lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and family members filled the space with their various hopes and fears. But in the evening, it held a different kind of energy, peaceful and contemplative, as though the weight of all those resolved cases had settled into a kind of institutional wisdom. Robert paused in the doorway of courtroom A, letting his flashlight beam sweep across the empty jury box, where citizens had deliberated over questions of guilt and innocence, liability and responsibility. Each jury had brought its own collection of life experiences to bear on the cases they heard, translating the abstract language of law into concrete decisions about how people should be held accountable for their actions and choices. The judge's bench stood elevated at the front of the room, positioned to provide authority and perspective on the proceedings that unfolded below. Judge Margaret Sullivan had presided over this courtroom for 15 years, developing a reputation for patience and fairness that had earned respect from both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Her approach to justice emphasized understanding over punishment, seeking solutions that would serve both individual accountability and community healing. The case files that crossed Judge Sullivan's desk told the full spectrum of human stories that found their way into the legal system. Many of these cases had begun in the police reports that filled the archives beneath the courthouse. Incidents that had required not just investigation but adjudication. Decisions about how society should respond to behavior that violated its standards or threatened its stability. Robert's flashlight illuminated the witness stand where countless people had testified about events that had disrupted their lives, telling their stories under oath and subject to cross-examination that tested both their memory and their credibility. Each witness had carried the weight of truth-telling, understanding that their words would contribute to decisions that might change lives forever. The courtroom held memories of cases that had challenged easy categorization of right and wrong, situations where Judge Sullivan had been called upon to balance competing claims of justice and mercy. One such case, documented in the files that were stored in the courthouse basement, had involved a young mother who had been charged with shoplifting. baby formula from a local grocery store. The case of People v. Maria Rodriguez had come before Judge Sullivan on a Tuesday morning in March 1985. Maria, aged 19, had been arrested for concealing 3 cans of infant formula in her coat and attempting to leave Morrison's grocery without paying. The total value of the stolen items was $23.97, barely enough to constitute a misdemeanor under state law. But the store manager had insisted on pressing charges as part of his policy of zero tolerance for theft. The arresting officer, Detective James Wilson, had filed a report that went beyond the simple facts of the arrest to include context about Maria's circumstances. She was a single mother whose boyfriend had left when she became pregnant, and she was struggling to survive on a part-time job that paid minimum wage and provided no benefits. Her application for government assistance had been delayed by bureaucratic complications, leaving her temporarily without resources to purchase necessities for her infant son. Detective Wilson had noted in his report that Maria had been cooperative and apologetic, explaining that she had attempted to purchase the formula, but had discovered that she was $3 short of the total cost. Rather than leaving the store empty-handed, she had made the impulsive decision to conceal the items, telling herself that she would return to pay for them when she received her next paycheck. The case had proceeded through the preliminary stages of the legal process, with Maria assigned a public defender who had worked to understand both the legal and social dimensions of her situation. Attorney Sarah Kim had conducted interviews with Maria that revealed the depth of her desperation and her genuine remorse for her actions, but also highlighted the systemic failures that had contributed to her desperate choice. Maria had been working as a part-time cashier at a fast food restaurant, earning wages that were insufficient to cover rent, utilities, and basic necessities for herself and her infant son. She had applied for food stamps and other assistance programs, but the application process had been complicated by requirements for documentation that was difficult for her to obtain without missing work, which she could not afford to do. The bureaucratic challenges had created a catch-22 situation where Maria needed assistance to maintain stability while she worked to improve her situation, but could not access assistance without sacrificing the work that provided her primary source of income. The theft of baby formula had been the result of a moment when this impossible situation had overwhelmed her judgment and led to a choice that she immediately regretted. Judge Sullivan had approached the case with the careful consideration that characterized her judicial philosophy. While Maria had clearly violated the law and needed to be held accountable for her actions, the circumstances that had led to her choice suggested that simple punishment would do little to address the underlying problems that had created the situation. The hearing had included testimony from Detective Wilson about the circumstances of the arrest and Maria's cooperation with the investigation. Attorney Kim had presented evidence about Maria's employment history, her efforts to access social services, and her lack of any previous criminal record. The store manager had testified about his policy regarding shoplifting and his belief that prosecuting all cases was necessary to deter future theft. Judge Sullivan had also heard from Maria herself, who had testified about her desperation on the day of the theft and her understanding that her actions were wrong regardless of her circumstances. Maria had expressed genuine remorse for her choices and had outlined plans for preventing similar situations in the future, including her intention to seek help from community organizations that she had not previously known existed. The resolution of the case had reflected Judge Sullivan's commitment to justice that served both accountability and community healing. Maria had been sentenced to community service at a local food bank, work that would allow her to contribute to addressing the same kind of food insecurity that had contributed to her own desperate choice. The sentence had also included connection with social services that could help her navigate the bureaucratic challenges that had prevented her from accessing legitimate assistance. More importantly, Judge Sullivan had worked with the store manager and local social service agencies to develop a protocol for addressing future cases where customers appeared to be stealing necessities due to genuine need rather than criminal intent. The protocol included training for store employees to recognize signs of desperation and procedures for connecting people with appropriate resources before theft became necessary for survival. The case had concluded with Maria successfully completing her community service and finding stable employment that provided sufficient income to support herself and her son. The food bank where she had performed her community service had offered her a permanent position coordinating their assistance programs, work that drew on her personal experience with food insecurity to help other families in similar situations. Robert continued his rounds, moving through the building's other courtrooms and offices, each space holding its own collection of stories about the intersection of human behavior and legal principle. The building's architecture seemed designed to slow down the pace of decision-making, creating spaces where careful deliberation could occur without the pressure of immediate action that characterized much of police work. The holding cells in the courthouse basement represented a different kind of institutional space, designed not for inspiration or contemplation, but for the temporary containment of people awaiting their appearance before a judge. These cells had held thousands of individuals over the decades, each one representing a life that had intersected with the legal system through choices or circumstances that had brought them to the attention of law enforcement. The cells were small and Spartan, furnished only with a bench and basic sanitary facilities, designed to provide security rather than comfort. Yet even these utilitarian spaces had witnessed moments of transformation as people awaiting trial or sentencing had time to reflect on their choices and consider how they might rebuild their lives in more positive directions. One such story was documented in the case files of People v. David Morrison, a breaking and entering case that had come before Judge Sullivan in the summer of 1985. David, aged 17, had been arrested for entering an abandoned house in the Riverside district and had been found sleeping in one of the upstairs bedrooms when police had responded to a neighbor's call about suspicious activity. The case had initially appeared straightforward, a simple matter of trespassing that would likely result in a fine or brief detention. However, Detective Patricia Martinez's investigation had revealed circumstances that transformed the case into something much more complex, requiring judicial decisions that went beyond simple law enforcement to address underlying social problems. David had been living in the abandoned house for several weeks after being expelled from his family home, following a series of conflicts with his stepfather. The conflicts had escalated to the point where David's mother had felt forced to choose between her son and her husband, a choice that had resulted in David's departure from the only stable housing he had known. The abandoned house had provided David with shelter while he attempted to find work and save money for legitimate housing. He had been careful not to damage the property and had even made some minor repairs to secure the building against other potential intruders. His presence in the house had been discovered when neighbors had noticed lights in what they knew to be an empty building. Detective Martinez's report had documented her efforts to understand David's family situation and the circumstances that had led to his homelessness. Her investigation had revealed a complex household dynamic where David's stepfather had been struggling with alcohol abuse and had become increasingly intolerant of what he perceived as David's disrespectful behavior. The conflicts had been exacerbated by economic stress, as David's stepfather had been laid off from his job at a local factory and had been unable to find comparable employment. The household had been surviving on David's mother's part-time income and unemployment benefits that were insufficient to maintain their previous standard of living. David's presence in the household had represented an additional financial burden at a time when resources were already stretched to the breaking point. His stepfather had begun blaming David for various household problems and had eventually issued an ultimatum that David either find his own place to live or face increasingly hostile treatment that was affecting the entire family. Judge Sullivan had approached David's case with recognition that simple punishment for trespassing would do nothing to address the homelessness that had motivated his choice to enter the abandoned building. The case required coordination between the legal system and social services to develop solutions that would serve both David's needs and the community's interest in maintaining property security. The hearing had included testimony from Detective Martinez about the circumstances of David's arrest and her assessment of his character and intentions. David's mother had testified about the family conflicts that had led to his departure from home and her hope that some kind of mediation might make it possible for him to return. A social worker from the county's youth services department had provided expert testimony about the challenges facing homeless teenagers and the limited options available for young people who could not return to their families but were not yet old enough to access most adult services independently. Judge Sullivan had crafted a resolution that addressed both David's immediate need for stable housing and the family dynamics that had created his homelessness. David had been placed in a transitional housing program that provided shelter and support services while he completed his high school education and prepared for independent living. The sentence had also included family counseling for David, his mother, and his stepfather, mediated by professionals who specialized in helping blended families navigate the challenges of economic stress and interpersonal conflict. The counseling had been designed to address the underlying issues that had led to David's expulsion from home, while respecting the legitimate concerns of all family members. The case had concluded successfully, with David completing his education while living in the transitional housing program and eventually reuniting with his family after the counseling had helped them develop better strategies for managing conflict and stress. His stepfather had also received assistance with alcohol abuse treatment and job placement services that had helped stabilize the household's economic situation. These cases represented the kind of judicial decision-making that transformed legal proceedings from simple punishment to community problem-solving, using the authority of the courts to coordinate resources and services that addressed the root causes of criminal behavior rather than just its immediate manifestations. Robert's flashlight beam swept across the law library that occupied the third floor of the courthouse, its shelves lined with the volumes of legal precedent that guided judicial decision-making. These books contained the accumulated wisdom of decades of legal reasoning, cases where judges had grappled with similar questions about balancing individual accountability with community welfare. The library had been used extensively by the attorneys who practiced in this courthouse, both prosecutors and defense lawyers who needed to research legal principles that would support their arguments. Before judges like Sullivan, the books had been consulted in preparation for cases that ranged from simple misdemeanors to complex felonies, each one requiring careful analysis of how legal principles should be applied to specific factual situations. During the day, the library buzzed with the quiet activity of legal research, attorneys and clerks searching through volumes of case law and statutes to find precedents that would support their positions. But in the evening, it held the peaceful atmosphere of any library, a place where knowledge was preserved and organized for future use, where the complexity of human behavior was analyzed through the disciplined application of legal reasoning. The legal principles contained in these volumes had been developed through centuries of judicial decision-making, cases where judges had been called upon to balance competing claims of justice and mercy, individual rights and community welfare. Each precedent represented a moment when a judge had made a decision about how society should respond to behavior that violated its standards, creating guidelines that would influence future cases involving similar circumstances. Judge Sullivan had spent countless hours in this library during her years of practice before ascending to the bench, researching precedents that would guide her arguments in cases where the law was unclear or where competing legal principles created tension. Her approach to judicial decision-making reflected this background in careful legal research, always grounding her rulings in established precedent while remaining sensitive to the unique circumstances of individual cases. The courthouse basement contained not only holding cells, but also the extensive archives where case files were stored after their resolution. These archives represented the institutional memory of the legal system, preserving the documentation of thousands of cases that had been heard and decided in the courtrooms above. The files were organized chronologically and by case type, creating a comprehensive record of how the legal system had addressed the full spectrum of human behavior that came to its attention. Each file contained not only the basic legal documents, but also the reports, testimony, and evidence that had been considered in reaching decisions about guilt, innocence, and appropriate consequences. These archives served multiple purposes within the justice system. They provided precedents for future cases involving similar circumstances, allowing judges and attorneys to understand how comparable situations had been handled in the past. They also served as a resource for researchers studying trends in criminal behavior and the effectiveness of different approaches to rehabilitation and deterrence. More importantly, the archives preserved the human stories that lay behind legal abstractions, documenting the real consequences of crime for both victims and perpetrators, while also recording the efforts of the legal system to respond to human complexity with wisdom and compassion. The case of People v. Eleanor Thompson, filed in the courthouse archives in the spring of 1985, represented another example of how Judge Sullivan had approached cases that required balancing multiple considerations of justice and community welfare. Eleanor, aged 73, had been charged with disturbing the peace after a series of incidents in which she had confronted people she believed were engaging in drug transactions in the park near her apartment. Eleanor's actions had been motivated by her concern about drug activity that she observed from her window. Transactions that seemed to be occurring with increasing frequency in what had previously been a quiet neighborhood park. Her confrontations with suspected drug dealers had become increasingly vocal and had eventually resulted in complaints from other park users who felt that her behavior was creating more disruption than the drug activity she was trying to address. The case had required Judge Sullivan to consider how to balance Eleanor's legitimate concerns about drug activity with the need to maintain public order and ensure that citizens did not take law enforcement into their own hands. Eleanor's intentions had been admirable, but her methods had created their own problems that needed to be addressed through legal channels. The resolution had involved connecting Eleanor with official channels for reporting drug activity while also providing her with alternative ways to contribute to community safety that did not require direct confrontation with potentially dangerous individuals. Eleanor had been assigned community service, working with a neighborhood watch program that coordinated with police to address drug activity through organized and supervised community involvement. The sentence had also included recognition of Eleanor's genuine commitment to community safety, acknowledging her concerns while redirecting her energy toward more effective and safer approaches to addressing the problems she had identified. The case had concluded with Eleanor becoming a leader in community organizing efforts that successfully reduced drug activity in the park through increased police presence and community engagement. These cases demonstrated how the courthouse served not just as a place for punishment, but as a center for community problem solving, where the authority of law was used to coordinate resources and services that addressed the complex social problems that contributed to criminal behavior. Robert completed his rounds through the building's upper floors, checking offices and conference rooms where attorneys met with clients and prosecutors prepared their cases. Each space had witnessed countless conversations about guilt and innocence, about the appropriate balance between accountability and mercy, about how society should respond to behavior that violated its standards, while still recognizing the humanity of those who had made poor choices. The building's architecture seemed designed to promote the kind of careful deliberation that characterized effective judicial decision-making. High ceilings and large windows created spaces that felt open and dignified, while solid construction and substantial furnishings conveyed the permanence and authority of legal institutions. The marble floors and wooden paneling had been chosen not just for their beauty, but for their durability. Materials that would age gracefully while maintaining the dignity appropriate to institutions charged with making decisions about justice and human freedom. The building was designed to inspire respect for legal processes, while also providing the practical functionality necessary for complex legal proceedings. As Robert completed his evening rounds and prepared to settle into his office for the quiet hours of overnight security duty, he felt the satisfaction that came from protecting an institution that served such important functions in maintaining community order and safety. The courthouse represented more than just a building. It was a symbol of society's commitment to resolving conflicts through reason and established procedure rather than through violence or arbitrary authority. The empty corridors and darkened courtrooms held the promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for justice to be served, for human conflicts to be resolved through careful application of legal principle to complex human circumstances. The building's silence was not empty, but full, filled with the accumulated wisdom of thousands of cases where judges, attorneys, and juries had worked together to maintain the delicate balance between individual freedom and community welfare that made civilized life possible. In the quiet of the courthouse at night, the essential work of justice continued its patient preservation, waiting for tomorrow's cases to test once again the community's commitment to resolving human conflicts through reason, compassion, and the careful application of law to the endless complexity of human behavior. The iron doors and marble halls stood ready to serve, as they had for decades, as guardians of the principle that justice, pursued with wisdom and patience, could help even flawed human beings find ways to live together in peace and mutual respect. Asterisk, the Maple Street neighborhood had existed in relative tranquility for most of its 40-year history. A collection of modest homes built in the post-war boom when families believed that suburban life could provide insulation from the complexities of urban existence. Detective Linda Walsh had been assigned to the neighborhood beat for 3 years, long enough to recognize the subtle patterns that indicated when the community's equilibrium was shifting, when individual problems were beginning to affect the collective sense of safety and well-being. The houses along Maple Street told the story of American middle-class aspiration, each one representing a family's investment in the idea that homeownership could provide stability and security for future generations. Front yards were maintained with varying degrees of care, from the meticulous landscaping of the Henderson family to the practical simplicity of the Garcia household, but all reflected an underlying commitment to maintaining neighborhood standards that would preserve property, values, and community pride. Detective Walsh understood that her job involved more than responding to individual incidents. She was responsible for maintaining the social fabric that allowed neighbors to trust each other and feel secure in their homes. Crime in residential neighborhoods created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims, affecting the sense of safety that made community life possible. The morning reports on her desk contained documentation of incidents that illustrated how individual choices created consequences for entire neighborhoods. The first report, filed by Officer Rodriguez, detailed a domestic disturbance call that had required careful handling to prevent escalation while also addressing the underlying family dynamics that were affecting multiple households on Elm Street. The disturbance had occurred at the Morrison residence, where Mr. James Morrison had been struggling with unemployment and alcohol abuse since losing his job at the local manufacturing plant 6 months earlier. The plant closure had affected numerous families in the neighborhood, creating economic stress that manifested itself in various forms of domestic tension and community strain. Officer Rodriguez's report documented his response to a call from Mrs. Dorothy Kim, who lived next door to the Morrisons and had become increasingly concerned about the loud arguments and occasional sounds of breaking dishes that were audible through the thin walls between their houses. Mrs. Kim had been reluctant to call police, understanding that involving law enforcement in domestic disputes could create additional problems for families already under stress. Her decision to make the call had been prompted by her realization that the Morrison family included 2 young children, ages 6 and 8, who were being exposed to increasing levels of conflict and instability. Mrs. Kim had occasionally seen the children playing in their backyard and had noticed that they seemed withdrawn and anxious, behaviors that suggested they were being affected by the tension in their household. Officer Rodriguez had approached the situation with the kind of patience that characterized effective community policing, recognizing that domestic disputes required careful assessment of multiple factors, including immediate safety concerns, underlying family dynamics, and the potential impact of police intervention on both the family and the neighborhood. His interview with Mr. Morrison had revealed the depth of stress that job loss had created for a man who had defined his identity through his role as provider for his family. The manufacturing job had provided not just income, but also social connections and a sense of purpose that had been central to Mr. Morrison's understanding of his place in the community. The plant closure had forced Mr. Morrison to confront the reality that the economic stability he had assumed would last throughout his working life was actually quite fragile, subject to forces beyond his control that could eliminate decades of steady employment with little warning. His response to this crisis had included increasing alcohol consumption that dulled his anxiety but also impaired his judgment and made him more likely to express his frustrations through anger directed at his family. Mrs. Sarah Morrison had been struggling with her own stress as she attempted to maintain household stability while also supporting her husband through his crisis and protecting their children from the emotional turmoil that was affecting their home. She had taken a part-time job to help with household expenses, but the income was insufficient to replace her husband's wages, and the work schedule made it difficult for her to provide the kind of attention that her children needed during this challenging period. Officer Rodriguez's report documented his assessment that while the situation was creating stress for the entire family, there were no immediate safety concerns that required removing children from the home or arresting Mr. Morrison for domestic violence. However, he had also recognized that without intervention to address the underlying problems, the situation was likely to deteriorate in ways that could eventually require more dramatic legal action. The resolution had involved connecting the Morrison family with community resources that could address both the immediate crisis and the underlying problems that had created it. Officer Rodriguez had worked with local social service agencies to provide Mr. Morrison with job placement assistance and alcohol counseling, while also connecting Mrs. Morrison with support services for families dealing with unemployment stress. More importantly, Officer Rodriguez had worked with Mrs. Kim and other neighbors to develop informal support network that could provide practical assistance to the Morrison family while they worked through their difficulties. This had included neighbors taking turns providing childcare that allowed Mrs. Morrison to attend counseling sessions and job interviews, as well as occasional help with grocery shopping and household maintenance that reduced the family's financial stress. The case had concluded successfully, with Mr. Morrison finding new employment and completing an alcohol treatment program, while the family participated in counseling that helped them develop better strategies for managing stress and communication. The neighborhood support network that had developed during the crisis had continued to function as a resource for other families facing similar challenges. Detective Walsh moved to the next report, which documented a series of car break-ins that had occurred throughout the Riverside district over a period of several weeks. The incidents had been investigated by Detective Martinez, who had approached the case not just as a property crime investigation, but as an opportunity to strengthen community cooperation in maintaining neighborhood security. Break-ins had followed a pattern that suggested they were being committed by someone familiar with the neighborhood's daily rhythms, someone who understood when residents were most likely to be away from their homes and when streets were most likely to be empty of potential witnesses. The thief had been selective, targeting vehicles that contained visible valuables but avoiding cars parked in areas with good visibility or near houses where residents were likely to be. Detective Martinez's investigation had included careful documentation of the times and locations of each incident, creating a map of criminal activity that revealed patterns in both the perpetrator's behavior and the neighborhood's vulnerabilities. Her analysis had shown that the break-ins were concentrated in areas where street lighting was inadequate and where residents had developed routines that made their absences predictable. The investigation had also revealed that the break-ins were affecting neighborhood dynamics in ways that extended beyond the immediate financial losses experienced by victims. Residents were becoming more suspicious of strangers and more protective of their property. Changes in behavior that were beginning to affect the informal social interactions that had previously characterized the community. Mrs. Helen Thompson, whose car had been broken into twice, had stopped participating in evening walks that had been part of her daily routine for several years. Mr. Frank Rodriguez had installed additional security lighting and had begun questioning any unfamiliar visitors to the neighborhood, creating tension with delivery services and repair workers who needed access to area homes. Detective Martinez had recognized that solving the break-in case required not just identifying and arresting the perpetrator, but also addressing the community fears and behavioral changes that the crimes had created. Her investigation had included extensive community outreach designed to gather information while also rebuilding the sense of collective security that made neighborhood life comfortable. She had organized neighborhood meetings where residents could share information about suspicious activities they had observed while also learning about practical steps they could take to reduce their vulnerability to property crimes. These meetings had served multiple purposes, providing Detective Martinez with investigative leads while also giving residents opportunities to work together on improving community security. The investigation had eventually led to the arrest of Tommy Chun, a 19-year-old college student who had been committing the break-ins to finance a drug habit that had developed during his first year at the local university. Tommy had been familiar with the neighborhood because he had grown up in an adjacent area and had been visiting friends who lived in the Riverside district. His knowledge of the community had allowed him to identify targets and avoid detection, but it had also meant that his arrest came as a shock to residents who recognized him as someone they had seen around the neighborhood for years. The revelation that the break-ins had been committed by a local young person rather than a stranger had created different kinds of community concerns about youth development and substance abuse. Detective Martinez's final report had documented the resolution of the case through a combination of criminal prosecution and community-based rehabilitation that addressed both Tommy's substance abuse problems and the neighborhood's need for restored security. Tommy had been sentenced to restitution and community service while also being required to participate in drug treatment and counseling programs. The community Service had been performed within the Riverside district, allowing Tommy to make direct amends to the neighborhood he had victimized, while also giving residents opportunities to see him as a young person struggling with addiction rather than simply as a criminal who had threatened their security. The case had concluded with the establishment of a neighborhood watch program that continued to function as a resource for maintaining community security while also serving as a mechanism for identifying young people who might be at risk for substance abuse or other problems that could lead to criminal behavior. Detective Walsh continued through the morning reports, each one documenting how individual crimes created consequences that extended throughout the residential communities where they occurred. The next report detailed an investigation into a series of bicycle thefts that had affected families throughout the Oakwood neighborhood, creating particular concern because the thefts seemed to be targeting children's bicycles specifically. The investigation had been conducted by Officer Kim, who had approached the case with recognition that bicycle theft in residential neighborhoods affected not just individual families, but also children's freedom to move independently through their community. The thefts had been occurring during school hours, when children's bicycles were left unattended in school parking areas or near community centers where after-school activities took place. Officer Kim's investigation had revealed that the thefts were being committed by a group of older teenagers who were taking the bicycles, not for their own use, but to sell to a local dealer who refurbished and resold them in other parts of the city. The operation had been systematic and organized, with the teenagers scouting locations during off hours and returning to steal bicycles when the areas were empty. The case had been complicated by the fact that several of the teenagers involved in the thefts were themselves residents of the neighborhoods they were victimizing, young people whose families were affected by the same crimes they were committing. The investigation had required Officer Kim to balance law enforcement objectives with community concerns about how prosecution might affect families who were already struggling with various economic and social challenges. The resolution had involved working with school officials, parents, and community leaders to develop an approach that held the teenage thieves accountable, while also addressing the underlying factors that had led to their involvement in criminal activity. The teenagers had been required to return stolen bicycles and perform community service related to bicycle safety and maintenance. More importantly, the case had led to the development of a community program that provided legitimate opportunities for teenagers to earn money through bicycle repair and maintenance services, channeling their mechanical skills toward productive activities that served community needs, rather than exploiting community vulnerabilities. The program had been coordinated through the local community center, with adult volunteers providing supervision and training, while teenagers learned marketable skills that could lead to legitimate employment opportunities. The program had also created positive relationships between the teenagers and community members who had initially seen them only as threats to neighborhood security. These cases illustrated how effective community policing required understanding the complex relationships between individual behavior and community dynamics, recognizing that crime in residential neighborhoods created ripple effects that could be addressed through coordinated responses that involved not just law enforcement, but also social services, schools, and community organizations. Detective Walsh found herself thinking about how the character of neighborhoods was shaped by the accumulated responses to individual incidents, how communities developed their sense of identity through the ways they addressed challenges and supported members who were struggling with various kinds of difficulties. The next report documented a case that had required particularly sensitive handling because it involved an elderly resident whose behavior was creating concerns among neighbors who were unsure whether they were observing criminal activity or symptoms of cognitive decline that required medical rather than legal intervention. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, age 78, had been reported by several neighbors for what appeared to be suspicious nighttime activities in her backyard. Behavior that included digging in her garden at unusual hours and burying objects that she retrieved from her house. The reports had been filed reluctantly by neighbors who had known Mrs. Hoffman for many years and were concerned about her welfare rather than fearful of criminal activity. Officer Chun had been assigned to investigate the reports, beginning with what could have been a case involving anything from hiding stolen property to disposing of evidence related to more serious crimes. However, his initial conversations with Mrs. Hoffman had revealed that her activities were related to memory problems that were causing her to forget where she had hidden valuable items and to develop obsessive behaviors around protecting her possessions. Mrs. Hoffman had been hiding jewelry, cash, and important documents in various locations throughout her house and yard, creating an elaborate system of concealment that was supposed to protect her valuables from theft. But that had become so complex that she could no longer remember where she had hidden things. Her nighttime digging was an attempt to retrieve items that she had buried but could no longer locate. Officer Chun's investigation had included consultation with Mrs. Hoffman's adult children, who lived in other cities and had not realized the extent of their mother's cognitive decline. His report had documented the need for medical evaluation and family intervention to ensure Mrs. Hoffman's safety while also addressing neighbors' concerns about her unusual behavior. The resolution had involved coordinating with medical professionals and social services to provide Mrs. Hoffman with appropriate care while also educating neighbors about how to recognize and respond to signs of cognitive decline in elderly community members. Mrs. Hoffman had been evaluated by a geriatrician who had diagnosed early-stage dementia and had recommended support services that would allow her to remain in her home safely. The case had concluded with the establishment of an informal network of neighbor support that helped Mrs. Hoffman maintain her independence while ensuring that she received assistance with activities that had become challenging for her to manage alone. The network had also served as a model for other neighborhoods, dealing with similar situations involving elderly residents who needed support but wanted to remain in their homes. These cases demonstrated how residential neighborhoods functioned as communities where individual problems became collective concerns, where the response to crime and other challenges required cooperation between law enforcement, social services, and informal networks of mutual support among residents. Detective Walsh continued through the reports, finding documentation of cases that illustrated the full spectrum of ways that crime affected family relationships and neighborhood dynamics. One particularly complex case had involved a situation where teenage drug use had created tensions not just within individual families, but also between families whose children had different levels of involvement with illegal substances. The case had begun with reports from parents in the Elmwood neighborhood who had discovered that their teenagers were using marijuana and alcohol at parties that were being held in the basement of a house whose parents were frequently away on business trips. The discovery had created divisions within the community between parents who wanted aggressive law enforcement response and those who preferred to handle the situation through family-based interventions. Detective Williams had been assigned to investigate the situation, recognizing that teenage substance use in residential neighborhoods required balancing law enforcement objectives with community preservation goals and family relationships that would continue long after any criminal cases had been resolved. Her investigation had revealed that the teenage drinking and drug use was part of a broader pattern of unsupervised socializing that had developed because many parents in the neighborhood worked demanding schedules that left their children with significant amounts of unsupervised time. The house where parties were occurring belonged to a family whose parents' business required frequent travel, leaving their teenage son with adult responsibilities, but without adult supervision. The investigation had also revealed that the substance use was occurring within a context of academic pressure and social stress that affected many teenagers in the neighborhood. Young people who were using alcohol and marijuana as ways of managing anxiety about school performance, college admission, and parental expectations. Detective Williams' approach to the case had emphasized understanding these underlying factors while also addressing the immediate legal and safety concerns created by teenage substance use. Her investigation had included extensive consultation with parents, school officials, and substance abuse counselors to develop responses that would address both legal violations and the social conditions that had contributed to the problem. The resolution had involved a combination of legal consequences for the most serious violations and community-based interventions designed to address the underlying factors that had contributed to the substance use. The teenagers who had been most involved in organizing and supplying alcohol and drugs had faced appropriate legal consequences, while those whose involvement had been limited to participation had been required to attend educational programs about substance abuse and its legal consequences. More importantly, the case had led to the development of community programs that provided supervised social activities for teenagers while also creating opportunities for parents to discuss common concerns about raising adolescents in an environment where academic and social pressures were creating stress for many young people. The programs had included expanded after-school activities at the local community center, parent education workshops about teenage development and substance abuse prevention, and peer counseling programs that allowed teenagers to support each other in making healthy choices about substance use and other risk behaviors. These cases illustrated how crime in residential neighborhoods often reflected broader social problems that required comprehensive responses, involving multiple community institutions working together to address both immediate safety concerns and underlying factors that contributed to criminal behavior. Detective Walsh found herself impressed by the creativity and patience that officers like Williams, Chun, Kim, and others had brought to cases that required understanding not just individual criminal behavior, but also the complex family and neighborhood dynamics that shaped community life in residential areas. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as Detective Walsh finished reviewing the morning reports, each one representing a different facet of how crime affected the intricate social networks that made neighborhood life possible. The cases documented in these reports showed how effective community policing required understanding that residential areas were not just collections of individual households but communities where people's lives were interconnected in ways that made individual problems into collective concerns. The reports also demonstrated how resolution of crime in residential neighborhoods often required rebuilding not just immediate safety, but also the trust and cooperation that allowed neighbors to support each other through various kinds of challenges. Crime created fear and suspicion that could damage community relationships, but thoughtful law enforcement responses could actually strengthen communities by creating opportunities for neighbors to work together in addressing shared concerns. As Detective Walsh prepared to begin her afternoon patrol through the neighborhoods she served, she carried with her the understanding that her job involved protecting not just individual safety, but also the social fabric that made community life possible. Each house on her beat represented a family whose security depended not just on locks and alarm systems, but also on the network of relationships with neighbors who looked out for each other and worked together to maintain the kind of environment where children could grow up safely and families could thrive. The neighborhoods were settling into their evening rhythms as parents returned from work and children finished their after-school activities. The daily renewal of community life that continued despite and because of the challenges that brought these residential areas to police attention. In the amber glow of porch lights beginning to illuminate against the gathering dusk, Detective Walsh could see the evidence of countless individual decisions to invest in community life, to maintain homes and relationships that created the stable foundation for family life and neighborhood identity. The crimes documented in her morning reports represented disruptions in this peaceful rhythm, moments when individual choices had created consequences for entire communities. But the resolutions documented in those same reports showed how communities could respond to these disruptions with wisdom and compassion, using the challenges created by crime as opportunities to strengthen the bonds that held neighborhoods together and to develop better ways of supporting all community members in making choices that contributed to collective well-being. In the quiet streets of her patrol area, Detective Walsh could see the evidence of this ongoing work of community building, the subtle signs that residents were looking out for each other and working together to maintain the kind of environment where families could feel secure and children could grow up with the support they needed to become contributing members of society. The work of community policing was really the work of community preservation, protecting not just individual safety, but also the social institutions that made civilized life possible in the residential neighborhoods, where most people live their daily lives. The 3rd District Police Station settled into its nighttime rhythm at exactly 11 p.m. When the last of the day's shift, supervisors turned off their office lights and the skeleton crew of night officers took their positions at desks that would become familiar landscapes over the 8 hours that stretched until dawn. Sergeant Patricia Newman had been working the night shift for 7 years, long enough to understand that police work after midnight moved to a different tempo, where immediate crises were less frequent, but the steady accumulation of reports and documentation never ceased. The station building itself seemed designed for this kind of around-the-clock operation, with fluorescent lighting that created pools of steady illumination in corridors that extended beyond the reach of natural light, and ventilation systems that maintained a constant, low hum that served as background music for the quiet conversations, and keyboard tapping that characterized most night shift activities. The front desk area remained staffed throughout the night, though the steady stream of visitors that characterized daytime operations slowed to occasional individuals who needed to file reports about incidents that had occurred during evening hours, or who were seeking information about family members who had been arrested during the day. The desk sergeant's position required patience and the ability to listen carefully to people who were often upset, confused, or frightened by their contact with the police. Tonight, Desk Sergeant Robert Martinez was working through a stack of incident reports that had been filed during the previous week, reviewing each one for completeness and accuracy before forwarding them to the appropriate detective divisions for follow-up investigation. The reports covered the full spectrum of police work, from minor traffic accidents to domestic disputes to property crimes that required careful documentation and systematic investigation. Each report represented hours of work by patrol officers who had responded to calls, interviewed witnesses, gathered evidence, and translated complex human situations into the standardized language that allowed the police department to track patterns and allocate resources effectively. The night shift provided time for this kind of careful review, when interruptions were less frequent and supervisors could focus on ensuring that investigations proceeded according to established procedures. The first report in Sergeant Martinez's stack documented a shoplifting incident at Morrison's department store that had been handled by Officer Kim during the previous afternoon. The case involved a teenage girl who had been caught attempting to steal cosmetics and clothing, items with a total value of approximately $60. a relatively minor theft that nonetheless required careful documentation because of the age of the suspect and the potential implications for her future. Officer Kim's report documented her patient approach to a situation that could have been handled as a simple criminal matter, but that had revealed underlying family and social issues that required more comprehensive intervention. The teenage girl, Lisa Rodriguez, aged 16, had been cooperative during questioning and had explained that she had been stealing items to sell to other students at school in order to earn money to help her family pay for groceries and utilities. Lisa's explanation had prompted Officer Kim to investigate the family's circumstances more thoroughly, revealing that Lisa's mother was working 2 part-time jobs while also caring for Lisa's younger siblings and an elderly grandmother who required constant supervision. The family's income was insufficient to cover basic necessities, leaving Lisa feeling responsible for finding ways to contribute to household expenses. The shoplifting had been Lisa's misguided attempt to help her family, using her knowledge of which cosmetics and clothing items were popular with her classmates to select merchandise that could be resold quickly. Her plan had been discovered when store security had noticed her unusual shopping patterns and had observed her concealing items in a large purse that she had brought specifically for that purpose. Officer Kim's report documented her decision to handle the case through diversion rather than formal prosecution, working with store management and social service agencies to address both the immediate legal issues and the underlying family problems that had motivated Lisa's criminal behavior. Lisa had been required to perform community service at a local food bank, while her family had been connected with assistance programs that could help them achieve financial stability. The resolution had included Lisa's participation in a job training program that would allow her to earn legitimate income while completing her high school education, providing her with practical skills and work experience that could lead to better employment opportunities in the future. The case had concluded with Lisa finding part-time employment that allowed her to contribute to her family's income without resorting to illegal activities. Sergeant Martinez moved to the next report, which documented a domestic disturbance call that had required careful handling to prevent escalation while also ensuring the safety of all family members involved. Officer Thompson had responded to a call from neighbors who had reported loud arguing and what sounded like furniture being thrown in an apartment on Oak Street. The disturbance had involved Mr. David Chun and his adult son Michael, who had been arguing about Michael's plans to drop out of college and pursue a career in music rather than continuing with his pre-medical studies. The argument had escalated because of underlying tensions about family expectations, financial pressures, and generational differences in values and priorities. Officer Thompson's report documented his assessment that while the argument had been loud and emotionally intense, there had been no physical violence or immediate safety concerns that required arrests or emergency interventions. However, he had also recognized that the family conflict represented deeper issues that could benefit from professional mediation and counseling services. His approach to the situation had emphasized de-escalation and communication, helping both father and son to express their concerns and fears in ways that could lead to understanding rather than continued conflict. Mr. Chun had been worried about his son's financial future and had felt that abandoning pre-medical studies would waste the family's investment in Michael's education and limit his opportunities for economic security. Michael had been frustrated by what he perceived as his father's inability to understand his passion for music and his belief that artistic fulfillment was more important than financial security. The argument had been exacerbated by Michael's recent decision to audition for a local band, a choice that had seemed to confirm his father's fears about his lack of commitment to traditional career paths. Officer Thompson's intervention had included separate conversations with both family members, allowing each to express their concerns without the immediate pressure of defending their positions against direct challenges. These conversations had revealed that both father and son shared underlying concerns about Michael's future success and happiness, though they disagreed about how those goals could best be achieved. The resolution had involved connecting the family with mediation services that specialized in helping parents and adult children navigate conflicts about career choices and life direction. The mediation had helped Mr. Chun and Michael to understand each other's perspectives while also developing a compromise that allowed Michael to pursue his musical interests while maintaining some connection to his academic studies. The case had concluded with Michael taking a leave of absence from college to pursue music for 1 year, with the understanding that he would return to complete his degree if the musical career did not provide sufficient income to support independent living. The arrangement had satisfied both father and son while also providing a structured way to test Michael's commitment to music and his ability to support himself through artistic work. These reports illustrated how night shift work often involved reviewing cases that required patience and creativity rather than immediate action. Situations where effective police work meant understanding complex human relationships and helping people find ways to resolve conflicts without resorting to violence or legal action that might damage family relationships permanently. The detective division maintained a small night shift crew to handle cases that required immediate follow-up investigation or that involved suspects who could only be interviewed during evening hours. Detective Sarah Williams was working through a case involving a series of vandalism incidents that had occurred at the local high school over a period of several weeks. The vandalism had been discovered each morning by custodial staff who had found graffiti, broken windows, and damaged equipment in various locations throughout the school building. The incidents had been occurring during weekend hours when the building was empty, suggesting that the vandals had knowledge of the school's security procedures and access patterns. Detective Williams had approached the investigation with recognition that school vandalism often reflected underlying issues with student alienation, academic stress, or social conflicts that could be addressed through educational and counseling interventions rather than simply through criminal prosecution. Her investigation had included extensive consultation with school administrators, teachers, and counselors to understand the social dynamics that might be contributing to the destructive behavior. The investigation had revealed that the vandalism was being committed by a small group of students who were struggling academically and socially, young people who felt disconnected from the school community and who were expressing their frustration through destructive actions that gained them attention and a sense of power over their environment. Detective Williams had worked with school officials to develop an approach that balanced accountability for the property damage with recognition of the underlying issues that had motivated the vandalism. The students involved had been required to make restitution for the damage while also participating in counseling and community service that addressed their feelings of alienation and disconnection. More importantly, the investigation had led to the development of programs designed to identify and support students who were at risk of engaging in destructive behavior, creating opportunities for academic and social engagement that provided alternatives to vandalism and other forms of acting out. The night shift also provided time for officers to complete training and professional development activities that were difficult to schedule during busier daytime hours. Officer Rodriguez was using the quiet period to review updates to department policies and procedures, ensuring that his knowledge of legal requirements and investigative techniques remained current with evolving standards and practices. The training materials covered topics ranging from new approaches to community policing to updated procedures for handling domestic violence cases to recent court decisions that affected how evidence could be collected and used in criminal prosecutions. The night shift provided the uninterrupted time necessary for careful study of these materials and reflection on how they might affect daily police work. This ongoing education was essential for maintaining the kind of professional competence that effective police work required, ensuring that officers understood not just the technical aspects of law enforcement, but also the social and legal contexts that shape their interactions with community members. The quiet hours of the night shift created space for the kind of thoughtful learning that improved the quality of police services and helped officers respond more effectively to the complex situations they encountered. The communication center operated continuously throughout the night, staffed by dispatchers who maintained contact with patrol units while also coordinating responses to emergency calls and routine service requests. The pace of calls was generally slower during night hours, but dispatchers needed to remain alert to handle serious incidents that could develop quickly and require immediate coordination of multiple resources. Margaret Foster had been working nights for 5 years, developing the kind of calm efficiency that allowed her to manage multiple radio conversations while also monitoring computer systems that tracked the location and status of patrol units throughout the district. Her work required constant attention to details that could affect officer safety and public service, ensuring that help was dispatched quickly when needed, while also managing routine communications that kept officers informed about developments in their assigned areas. The radio communications during night shifts often reflected the different pace and character of police work during these hours, with more time for detailed discussions of cases and less pressure to handle calls quickly in order to respond to the next emergency. This allowed for more thorough coordination between officers and supervisors, better sharing of information about ongoing investigations, and more comprehensive planning for complex cases that required multiple resources. The evidence room operated with reduced staffing during night hours, but Officer Chun was using the quiet time to organize and catalog items that had been collected during recent investigations. The proper handling and storage of evidence required meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that chain of custody procedures were followed and that items were preserved in ways that would maintain their integrity for potential use in court proceedings. Each piece of evidence represented a fragment of a larger story, physical objects that could help prosecutors and defense attorneys reconstruct events and establish facts about criminal incidents. The careful organization and documentation of evidence was essential for ensuring that investigations proceeded effectively and that court cases were supported by reliable physical proof. Officer Chun's work involved more than just storage and organization. He was also responsible for coordinating with laboratory technicians who conducted scientific analysis of evidence, with attorneys who needed access to materials for case preparation, and with investigators who required specific items for follow-up work. The night shift provided time for this kind of detailed coordination without the interruptions that characterized busier daytime operations. The jail facility attached to the police station maintained its own night shift operations, with officers responsible for monitoring individuals who had been arrested during evening hours and were awaiting arraignment or transfer to longer-term detention facilities. This work required vigilance and compassion, ensuring the safety and welfare of people who were often intoxicated, upset, or confused about their legal situation. Officer Martinez was responsible for conducting regular checks on detainees, while also completing the paperwork necessary for processing arrests and preparing cases for court presentation. His work included coordination with bail bondsmen, attorneys, and family members who were seeking information about detained individuals. Communications that required patience and clear explanation of legal procedures that were often unfamiliar to people experiencing their first contact with the criminal justice system. The detention facility also served as a place where people who had been arrested could begin to reflect on their choices and consider how they might address the problems that had led to their contact with law enforcement. Officer Martinez often found himself serving as an informal counselor, listening to detainees who wanted to talk about their situations, and providing information about resources that might help them address underlying issues like substance abuse, unemployment, or family conflicts. The night shift created opportunities for these kinds of extended conversations. When the pressure of processing large numbers of arrests was reduced and officers could spend more time with individuals who were struggling with various kinds of personal crises. These conversations often revealed the complex circumstances that had contributed to criminal behavior, information that could be valuable for developing appropriate responses that addressed both legal accountability and underlying social problems. The Records Division continued its work throughout the night, with clerks processing reports and updating databases that tracked criminal activity patterns and investigative progress. This work was essential for maintaining the institutional memory that allowed the police department to identify trends, allocate resources effectively, and coordinate investigations that might span multiple shifts and involve numerous officers. Clerk Dorothy Kim was working through a backlog of incident reports that needed to be entered into the department's computer system, ensuring that information was available to investigators and supervisors who would be reviewing cases during the following day. Her work required careful attention to detail and accuracy, as the information she entered would become the basis for statistical analysis and resource planning that affected the entire department's operations. The data entry work also involved cross-referencing new incidents with previous cases to identify patterns that might indicate ongoing criminal activity or repeat offenders who required special attention. This analytical work often revealed connections between apparently unrelated incidents, information that could help investigators develop more effective strategies for addressing criminal behavior that affected multiple neighborhoods or victim groups. As the night progressed toward dawn, the pace of activity in the police station began to change, with officers preparing for the transition to day shift operations and completing the documentation that would allow their colleagues to continue ongoing investigations and respond to new incidents. The night shift had served its function of maintaining public safety during hours when most citizens slept, while also providing time for the detailed work of report writing, evidence processing, and case analysis that supported effective law enforcement. The fluorescent lights that had provided steady illumination throughout the night would soon be supplemented by natural light filtering through windows as the city awakened to another day of activity that would generate new calls for police service. But the work accomplished during the quiet hours of the night shift had prepared the department to respond effectively to whatever challenges the new day might bring, maintaining the continuity of professional service that made community safety possible. In the steady hum of ventilation systems and the soft clicking of keyboards, in the low conversations between officers discussing ongoing cases and the periodic radio transmissions that maintained communication between patrol units and headquarters, the essential work of law enforcement continued its patient progression through the night hours. Each report completed, each piece of evidence properly cataloged, each detainee safely monitored represented a small but significant contribution to the larger effort of maintaining the rule of law and protecting the welfare of community members who depended on police services. The night shift had its own rhythm and character, different from the more visible and dramatic aspects of police work that occurred during daylight hours, but equally important for maintaining the comprehensive approach to public safety that effective law enforcement required. In the quiet dedication of officers who worked while the city slept, the promise of justice and protection continued its steady fulfillment, ready to meet whatever challenges would emerge with the dawn. The evidence storage facility occupied the entire basement level of the auxiliary building behind the main police station, a maze of climate-controlled rooms where thousands of case files rested, alongside the physical artifacts that had once served as crucial elements in criminal investigations. Detective Margaret Foster had been assigned to the Cold Case Division for 8 months, long enough to develop an appreciation for the particular atmosphere of these archives, where time moved differently and every file cabinet held stories that had once commanded the full attention of investigators and community members. The fluorescent lighting in the evidence rooms had been designed to provide consistent illumination without the heat fluctuations that might damage sensitive materials, creating an environment where photographs from decades past retained their clarity and documents preserved their legibility despite the passage of years. Walking through these corridors felt like moving through a museum of human behavior, where the most dramatic moments of people's lives had been carefully cataloged and preserved for potential future reference. Detective Foster found herself drawn to Section M, where cases from the mid-1970s were stored in bankers' boxes that had been sealed and labeled with the meticulous care that characterized the record-keeping of that era. Each box contained not just the official reports and legal documents that comprised the formal record of investigation and prosecution, but also the photographs, sketches, and physical evidence that had allowed investigators to reconstruct events and establish facts about criminal incidents. The first box she opened contained materials from a case that had been classified as burglary but had evolved into something much more complex as investigators had worked to understand the motivations and circumstances that had driven the criminal behavior. The case file for People v. Thomas Henderson, dated April 1975, documented what had initially appeared to be a series of break-ins, targeting homes in the affluent Riverside Heights neighborhood. The crime scene photographs showed the methodical way that Detective Robert Martinez had documented each incident, capturing not just the obvious signs of forced entry, but also the subtle details that had eventually revealed the unusual nature of these particular burglaries. Unlike typical break-ins that targeted valuable electronics or jewelry, these incidents had involved the theft of personal items that seemed to have been selected for their sentimental rather than monetary value. Photograph Number 7 showed the bedroom of Mrs. Dorothy Kim, where the burglar had taken a small music box that had belonged to her grandmother, but had left behind expensive jewelry that was stored in the same dresser drawer. The music box had been a simple wooden piece with no precious metals or stones, valuable only for its connection to family history and childhood memories. Photograph Number 12B documented the Henderson family living room, where the burglar had taken a collection of family photographs but had ignored an expensive stereo system that would have been easy to carry and simple to resell. The photographs had been carefully removed from their frames, which had been left neatly stacked on the mantelpiece where the pictures had originally been displayed. Detective Martinez's investigation had proceeded with the patient, methodical approach that characterized police work from that era, when officers had more time to develop theories and follow leads that might not produce immediate results but could eventually reveal patterns that explained apparently random criminal behavior. His reports documented weeks of careful analysis as he had worked to understand what connected the various items that had been stolen and what might motivate someone to take objects that had personal but not commercial value. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Martinez had noticed that all of the stolen items seemed to represent memories of family relationships and personal history, objects that served as tangible connections to people and experiences that had shaped the victims' identities. This pattern had suggested that the burglar was motivated not by economic need, but by some kind of psychological compulsion related to family and belonging. The investigation had eventually led to Thomas Henderson, a 23-year-old man who had been adopted as an infant and had recently learned about his biological family's identity. Thomas had been struggling with questions about his own history and identity, feelings that had been intensified by his adoptive parents' recent death in an automobile accident and his discovery of documents that revealed details about his biological family that he had never known. The burglaries had been Thomas's misguided attempt to create connections to family history and personal memory, taking items from homes throughout the community and incorporating them into an elaborate shrine that he had constructed in his apartment. The stolen photographs, music boxes, and personal mementos had been arranged to create the impression of a family history that Thomas had never actually experienced but desperately wanted to possess. Detective Martinez's final report had documented the complex resolution of the case, which had required balancing Thomas's need for mental health treatment with the victims' rights to have their property returned and their sense of security restored. Thomas had been charged with burglary but had been sentenced to probation and mandatory counseling rather than incarceration. Recognition that his criminal behavior had been motivated by psychological distress rather than malicious intent. The case had concluded with Thomas participating in therapy that helped him develop healthier ways of dealing with his feelings about adoption and family identity, while also making personal apologies to each of the families whose homes he had burglarized. Many of the victims had expressed understanding and compassion for Thomas's situation, recognizing that his crimes had been motivated by pain rather than greed. Detective Foster moved to another box, this one containing materials from a case that had captured significant community attention in 1976 when a series of anonymous letters had been sent to local newspapers containing detailed information about unsolved crimes. The letters had been signed only a friend of justice and had provided tips and observations that had helped police solve several cases that had been stalled for months. The case file for the anonymous letter investigation contained photocopies of the original correspondence, each letter carefully preserved and protective, sleeves that maintained their condition while allowing investigators to examine the handwriting and paper quality that might provide clues about the author's identity. The letters had been written in neat cursive script on standard stationery, suggesting someone with education and attention to detail, but providing few specific clues about their identity. Letter number 1, dated March 15, 1976, had provided information about a hit-and-run accident that had occurred 6 months earlier, including details about the vehicle involved that had not been reported by any official witnesses. The letter had described seeing a blue sedan with damage to its front bumper parked behind Morrison's auto repair shop, information that had led police to identify the driver who had fled the scene after striking a pedestrian. Letter number 4, dated May 3, 1976, had contained observations about suspicious activity at a warehouse that had been the target of several recent thefts. The letter had described seeing individuals loading boxes into a truck during hours when the warehouse should have been empty, information that had helped police identify and arrest a group of employees who had been stealing inventory and selling it through an elaborate fencing operation. Detective Sarah Chun had been assigned to investigate the anonymous letters, working to determine whether the information was legitimate or whether the letters represented some kind of hoax or attempt to manipulate police investigations. Her careful analysis had confirmed that the information in the letters was accurate and had been instrumental in solving several serious crimes. The investigation into the letter writer's identity had revealed that the correspondence was coming from Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a 67-year-old retired librarian who had developed an extensive knowledge of criminal activity in her neighborhood through years of careful observation and record-keeping. Mrs. Patterson had been keeping detailed notes about suspicious activities she observed from her apartment window, which overlooked several businesses and intersections where criminal activity frequently occurred. Mrs. Patterson's motivation for writing the anonymous letters had been her frustration with what she perceived as the police department's inability to solve crimes that seemed obvious to her based on her careful observations. She had chosen to remain anonymous because she was concerned about potential retaliation from criminals who might discover her identity, but she had also been motivated by a genuine desire to help law enforcement protect her community. Detective Chun's investigation had led to a meeting between Mrs. Patterson and police supervisors, where they had worked out an arrangement that allowed her to continue providing information while also ensuring her safety and coordinating her observations with official police investigations. Mrs. Patterson had become an unofficial consultant to the police department, providing intelligence that proved valuable in numerous subsequent cases. The case had concluded with the establishment of a formal community informant program that allowed citizens to provide information about criminal activity through secure channels that protected their anonymity, while also ensuring that police could verify and act on the intelligence they provided. Mrs. Patterson had served as a model for this program, demonstrating how community members could contribute to law enforcement efforts while maintaining their safety and privacy. These old case files contained photographs that captured moments of high drama and intense emotion, but viewing them decades later created a different kind of experience, where the immediate urgency had been replaced by historical perspective that allowed for more thoughtful analysis of the human motivations and social conditions that had contributed to criminal behavior. Detective Foster pulled another file, this one containing materials from a case that had involved the discovery of a large marijuana growing operation in the basement of an abandoned house in the industrial district. The case had been significant, not just because of the size of the operation, but because of the sophisticated techniques that had been used to conceal the activity and the unexpected identity of the person responsible for managing it. The crime scene photographs showed an elaborate setup that had transformed the basement into a controlled environment suitable for large-scale plant cultivation, complete with artificial lighting, ventilation systems, and irrigation equipment. That represented a significant investment in both time and money. The operation had been discovered when neighbors had reported unusual electrical usage patterns and the smell of growing plants that seemed inconsistent with the building's abandoned status. Detective Williams had led the investigation into what had initially appeared to be a straightforward drug manufacturing case, but had evolved into something more complex as investigators had worked to understand the motivations and circumstances that had led to the creation of such an elaborate operation. In a seemingly abandoned building, the investigation had revealed that the marijuana growing operation was being managed by Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, a 45-year-old retired chemistry professor who had been growing marijuana to provide medication for her husband, who was suffering from cancer and had found that marijuana helped manage the pain and nausea associated with his chemotherapy treatments. Dr. Rodriguez had established the operation after discovering that her husband's medical insurance would not cover the cost of prescription medications that provided similar benefits to marijuana, and after learning that obtaining marijuana through illegal channels involved contact with criminal organizations that she considered dangerous and unpredictable. Her scientific background had allowed her to create a sophisticated growing operation that produced high-quality marijuana in quantities sufficient to meet her husband's medical needs while also providing surplus that she had been quietly distributing to other cancer patients who were struggling with similar medical and financial challenges. Detective Williams's investigation had documented the careful way that Dr. Rodriguez had managed the operation, maintaining detailed records of plant genetics, growing conditions, and distribution that reflected her scientific training and her commitment to providing consistent, high-quality medication to people who had limited alternatives for managing their medical conditions. The case had presented complex legal and ethical questions about the enforcement of drug laws in situations where illegal activity was motivated by medical necessity rather than profit, and where the person involved had no prior criminal history and was providing what many people considered to be a valuable community service. The resolution had involved extensive consultation between prosecutors, medical professionals, and community leaders to develop an approach that recognized both the legal violations that had occurred and the humanitarian motivations that had driven Dr. Rodriguez's choices. Dr. Rodriguez had been charged with drug manufacturing, but had been sentenced to community service and probation rather than incarceration. More importantly, the case had contributed to ongoing discussions about medical marijuana legislation and had helped educate law enforcement officials about the complex circumstances that sometimes motivated people to violate drug laws for medical rather than recreational purposes. The photographs from this case captured not just the physical evidence of criminal activity, but also the careful attention to detail and scientific precision that Dr. Rodriguez had brought to her illegal operation. Images that complicated simple categories of criminal and lawful behavior by showing how someone with admirable motivations could find themselves in conflict with legal systems that had not anticipated their particular circumstances. Detective Foster continued through the archived materials, finding case after case where the passage of time had transformed urgent investigations into historical documents that provided insights into both criminal behavior and the social conditions that had shaped community life in earlier decades. One particularly intriguing file contained materials from a case involving art theft that had occurred at the local museum in 1977, where several valuable paintings had been stolen during what had initially appeared to be a professional burglary, but had eventually been revealed as something quite different. The crime scene photographs showed the museum gallery where the paintings had been displayed, with detailed documentation of the security systems that had been bypassed and the methods that had been used to remove the artworks from their frames and transport them from the building. The theft had been discovered when museum staff had arrived for work and had found empty frames and disabled alarm systems that suggested a carefully planned and expertly executed operation. Detective Martinez had approached the investigation with recognition that art theft often involved specialized knowledge and connections to illegal markets that were different from typical property crimes, requiring investigation techniques that went beyond standard burglary procedures to include consultation with art historians, insurance investigators, and specialists in stolen art recovery. The investigation had eventually revealed that the theft had been committed by Marcus Chen, a 34-year-old art history graduate student who had been researching the provenance of the stolen paintings and had discovered that they had been looted from Jewish families during World War II and had never been returned to their rightful owners or their descendants. Marcus had stolen the paintings not to sell them for personal profit, but to return them to the families from whom they had originally been taken, families who had been trying for decades to recover artwork that had been stolen from them during the Holocaust but had been unable to navigate the complex legal and bureaucratic procedures that governed the return of looted art. His theft of the paintings had been motivated by his belief that the museum's possession of the artwork was itself a form of theft, even though the museum had acquired the paintings through legitimate channels and had no knowledge of their original ownership history. Marcus had been working to research the family's current locations and to arrange for the paintings to be returned to them directly rather than through official channels that he believed were too slow and bureaucratic to provide justice for Holocaust survivors. Detective Martinez's investigation had uncovered the complex legal and ethical questions surrounding the ownership of artwork that had been looted during wartime, issues that involved international law, museum ethics, and the rights of Holocaust survivors and their descendants to recover property that had been stolen from their families. The resolution of the case had involved extensive collaboration between law enforcement, museum officials, art historians, and representatives of the families who were the original owners of the stolen paintings. Marcus had been charged with theft, but had received a suspended sentence in recognition of his humanitarian motivations, while the museum had worked with the families to arrange for the return of the artwork through official channels. The case had concluded with the establishment of new procedures for researching the provenance of museum holdings, and for addressing claims from families who believed that artwork in public collections had originally been stolen from their relatives during wartime. Marcus had been hired as a consultant for this research, using his expertise to help resolve ownership questions for other potentially looted artworks. These archived case files represented more than just documentation of past criminal investigations. They were records of how communities had grappled with complex questions about justice, ethics, and the appropriate response to behavior that violated laws, but was motivated by understandable human needs and desires. The photographs, reports, and evidence preserved in these files provided windows into different eras of social attitudes and law enforcement practices, showing how approaches to criminal justice had evolved over time while also revealing the timeless, human motivations that continued to drive both criminal behavior and the community responses to it. Detective Foster found herself thinking about how these old cases related to contemporary law enforcement challenges, recognizing that while specific technologies and procedures had changed, the fundamental questions about balancing individual accountability with community welfare remained remarkably consistent across the decades. The evidence rooms continued to preserve these stories with quiet dignity, maintaining the physical artifacts and documentary evidence that allowed future investigators and researchers to understand how previous generations had addressed similar challenges and what lessons could be learned from their successes and failures. As the afternoon light filtered through the small windows that provided the only natural illumination in the evidence facility, Detective Foster prepared to return the files to their proper storage locations, ensuring that each box was positioned exactly as she had found it. These stories deserved that kind of care, that attention to preservation that would allow future officers to discover them and learn from the wisdom they contained. The archived cases held their secrets with patient silence, waiting for the next researcher who would need to understand that criminal investigation, at its best, required not just technical competence, but also the wisdom to recognize the complex human motivations that drove behavior, and the creativity to develop responses that served both justice and community healing. In the amber half-light of the evidence rooms, surrounded by thousands of case files that represented the accumulated experience of decades of police work, the essential lessons of law enforcement continued their quiet preservation, ready to inform future officers who would face similar challenges with the same need for patience, understanding, and commitment to serving both individual accountability and community welfare. Asterisk. Detective Robert Chun had been walking the same beats for 15 years, long enough to see how the city's geography told the story of crime and community in layers that accumulated like sediment, each decade adding its own collection of incidents and resolutions that became part of the neighborhood's collective memory. On this autumn morning in 1989, he found himself approaching the intersection of 5th and Main with a kind of recognition that came from having responded to calls at this location dozens of times. Over the years, the corner building that housed Morrison's Hardware had been the site of 3 different criminal investigations during Detective Chun's tenure, each one revealing different aspects of how economic pressure, family dynamics, and community relationships intersected to create the conditions where crime became a response to problems that seemed to have no other solutions. The first case had occurred in 1976, when the store had been burglarized by 2 teenagers who had needed money to help their family avoid eviction from their apartment. The second had been a shoplifting incident in 1982, involving an elderly woman who had been taking small items to give as gifts because her fixed income left no money for purchasing presents for her grandchildren. The most recent had been an armed robbery in 1987 committed by a young man whose gambling addiction had created debts that he could not pay through legitimate means. Asterisk. Each case had been resolved through different approaches that reflected both the specific circumstances of the individuals involved and the evolving understanding of how law enforcement could best serve community needs while maintaining accountability for criminal behavior. The teenagers had been required to make restitution while also receiving assistance with family financial counseling. The elderly woman had been connected with social services and volunteer programs that provided her with legitimate ways to help her grandchildren. The young man had been sentenced to treatment for gambling addiction along with community service that helped him understand the impact of his choices on others. Standing at this familiar intersection, Detective Chun could see how the physical environment itself had changed in response to these incidents and others like them. The hardware store had installed better lighting and security systems, but had also become more involved in community programs that provided legitimate opportunities for young people to earn money and for elderly residents to find social connections that reduced their isolation and desperation. The changes were subtle but significant, representing the way that communities adapted to challenges while maintaining their essential character and function. The store remained a gathering place where neighbors encountered each other during routine errands, but it had also become a site where people understood that individual problems could become community concerns and that solutions often required cooperation between businesses, residents, and law enforcement. Detective Chun continued his walk through the downtown area, noting how each block contained its own collection of stories that had shaped the current configuration of buildings, businesses, and public spaces. The small park at the corner of 3rd and Oak had been redesigned in 1984 after a series of drug transactions had made it unsafe for families, but the redesign had incorporated input from community members who wanted to maintain the park's function as a gathering place while eliminating the secluded areas that had attracted illegal activity. The park now featured open sight lines, improved lighting, and programmed activities that drew legitimate users throughout the day and evening. Children played on equipment that had been positioned to be visible from surrounding houses, while elderly residents used benches that were placed to encourage conversation and mutual observation. The drug activity had moved to other locations, but the park had become a stronger community asset that served its intended function more effectively. The changes represented more than just crime prevention. They reflected a deeper understanding of how public spaces could be designed to support the kinds of social interactions that strengthened community bonds and created natural surveillance that deterred criminal activity without creating an atmosphere of suspicion or fear. Detective Chun's route took him past the old Riverside Elementary School, which had been converted to a community center in 1985 after the school district had consolidated facilities. The building had been the site of several incidents during its transition period, when it had sat empty for 2 years while community leaders debated its future use. During those empty years, the building had attracted vandalism from teenagers who saw it as an abandoned space where they could act without adult supervision. More seriously, it had been used as a shelter by homeless individuals who needed protection from weather but had no access to official services. The building had also been burglarized several times by people who were looking for valuable items that might have been left behind when the school had closed. Each of these incidents had prompted different responses from law enforcement and community members, gradually building toward a comprehensive approach that addressed both the immediate security concerns and the underlying social needs that had made the empty building attractive to various groups of people. The vandalism had been addressed through increased patrols and community meetings that helped parents understand what their teenagers were doing during unsupervised hours. The homeless individuals had been connected with social services and temporary housing while community leaders worked to develop permanent solutions for people who needed shelter but fell outside the eligibility requirements for existing programs. The burglaries had led to improved security for the building while it remained empty, but they had also prompted faster decision-making about the building's future use. as community leaders recognized that empty buildings created problems that affected entire neighborhoods. The resolution had been the conversion of the building into a community center that provided services and activities for multiple age groups throughout the day and evening, creating natural supervision that prevented most criminal activity while also addressing some of the social needs that had contributed to the problems during the building's vacant period. Detective Chun paused outside the community center, observing the steady stream of people entering and leaving the building for various programs and services. Children attended after-school programs that provided supervision and enrichment while their parents worked. Teenagers participated in sports and arts programs that channeled their energy toward productive activities. Adults used meeting rooms for community organizations and support groups. Senior citizens attended social programs that reduced their isolation and provided opportunities for meaningful engagement with younger generations. The building's transformation represented the kind of community problem-solving that characterized the most effective responses to crime and social disorder, approaches that addressed underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms, and that created positive alternatives rather than simply eliminating negative options. Walking through the residential neighborhoods that surrounded the downtown area, Detective Chun could see how individual houses and blocks had been shaped by their own histories of criminal incidents and community responses. The house at 247 Maple Street had been the site of a domestic violence incident in 1981 that had led to the arrest of Robert Morrison, but it had also become a symbol of how families could rebuild after crisis through the support of neighbors and professional services. Mrs. Morrison and her 2 children had remained in the house after her husband's conviction and incarceration, receiving assistance from community members who had helped with childcare, transportation, and emotional support during the difficult period of family reorganization. The house had become a gathering place for other women who were dealing with similar situations, creating an informal network of mutual support that served multiple families throughout the county. A formal network of mutual support neighborhood. The front yard still showed evidence of the community support that had sustained the Morrison family during their crisis, with flower gardens that had been planted by neighbors and maintained through collective effort. The house had retained its place in the neighborhood's social fabric, but it had also become a resource for other families who needed help navigating challenges that could otherwise lead to isolation and desperation. 3 blocks away, the house at 156 Oak Street had been burglarized 4 times between 1983 and 1985. Incidents that had initially created fear and suspicion among neighbors who worried that their own homes might be targeted. However, the repeated incidents had also prompted community organizing that had transformed the entire block into a more cohesive and mutually supportive neighborhood. Residents had established a block watch program that created regular communication about security concerns while also fostering social relationships that made neighbors more likely to look out for each other's welfare. They had worked together to improve lighting and eliminate the overgrown landscaping that had provided concealment for criminal activity. More importantly, they had developed relationships that allowed them to identify and assist community members who were struggling with problems that might otherwise lead to criminal behavior. The house itself had been purchased by a young family who had worked with neighbors to address the security vulnerabilities that had made it an attractive target for burglars. The new owners had become active participants in the Block Watch program, contributing to the collective security that had prevented further incidents, while also strengthening the social connections that made the neighborhood a more pleasant place to live. Detective Chun's walk took him across the bridge that connected the downtown area to the industrial district, a structure that had been the site of several dramatic incidents but had also become a symbol of community resilience and cooperation. In 1978, the bridge had been the location where Thomas Patterson had threatened to jump during the crisis, related to job loss and family problems that had seemed overwhelming to him. The incident had drawn police officers, firefighters, and community members who had worked together to talk Thomas down from the bridge, while also addressing the immediate crisis that had brought him to that desperate point. The resolution had required not just crisis intervention, but also long-term support that helped Thomas address his employment problems and develop better strategies for managing stress and depression. The bridge had been equipped with additional safety features following the incident, but more importantly, the community response had led to the development of better mental health services in crisis intervention programs that provided support for people who were struggling with similar challenges before they reached the point of contemplating suicide. Thomas had become a volunteer with the crisis intervention program, using his experience to help other people who were dealing with overwhelming stress and depression. The bridge had become associated not just with his moment of crisis, but also with the community's commitment to supporting people through difficult periods and helping them find alternatives to desperation. The industrial district on the other side of the bridge contained its own geography of crime and community response, with warehouses and factories that had been the sites of various incidents, but had also become partners in maintaining neighborhood security and supporting worker welfare. The large warehouse at the end of Industrial Boulevard had been burglarized repeatedly in the early 1980s, losses that had threatened the viability of several small businesses that rented space in the building. The burglaries had been committed by a group of former employees who had been laid off during an economic downturn and had turned to theft as a way of expressing their anger while also obtaining items they could sell to supplement unemployment benefits that were insufficient to support their families. The investigation had revealed not just the identity of the perpetrators, but also the economic pressures that had contributed to their choices. The resolution had involved prosecution of the individuals responsible for the thefts, but it had also led to the development of programs that provided better support for laid-off workers, and that created opportunities for former employees to maintain connections with their previous workplaces even when full-time employment was not available. The warehouse had implemented improved security measures, but the building's owners had also established a job placement service that helped connect unemployed workers with temporary and part-time opportunities throughout the district. The service had reduced the desperation that had motivated the original burglaries while also creating a resource that benefited the entire industrial community. Detective Chun's route through the industrial district took him past the small restaurant where Maria Santos had worked double shifts to support her family after her husband had been injured in an industrial accident that had left him unable to work. The restaurant had been robbed in 1986 by two men who had taken the day's receipts and the tips that represented Maria's primary source of income. The robbery had devastated Maria's already precarious financial situation, but it had also prompted community members to organize support that helped her family survive the immediate crisis, while longer-term solutions were developed. The restaurant's owner had worked with other business owners to create a mutual aid fund that provided assistance to employees who were victimized by crime or who faced other emergencies that threatened their economic stability. The fund had helped Maria replace the lost income while also providing resources for other workers who faced similar challenges. The restaurant had installed better security systems, but it had also become a gathering place for discussions about worker safety and community support that strengthened relationships throughout the district. The robbery suspects had eventually been arrested and convicted, but the community response had created lasting changes that improved conditions for workers throughout the area and that provided models for other communities dealing with similar challenges. As Detective Chun completed his circuit through the neighborhoods that comprised his beat, he reflected on how the city's geography had been shaped by countless individual incidents that had tested the community's capacity for maintaining safety, while also supporting the welfare of all residents. Each street corner, each building, Each public space held memories of challenges that had been met with varying degrees of success. But that had contributed to the accumulated wisdom about how communities could address crime and social disorder. The physical environment told the story of these efforts through subtle changes in lighting, landscaping, building design, and space utilization that reflected lessons learned through experience about how to create conditions that supported positive behavior while discouraging criminal activity. More importantly, the geography revealed the social networks and community relationships that had developed in response to shared challenges and that continued to provide the foundation for collective security and mutual support. Detective Chun's 15 years of walking these same streets had taught him that effective law enforcement required understanding not just individual criminal incidents but also the broader patterns of community life that shaped the conditions where crime occurred and where it could be prevented. The city itself had become his textbook, each neighborhood providing lessons about human behavior and community dynamics that informed his approach to new challenges. The streets and buildings would continue to evolve in response to future incidents and community changes, but they would retain the accumulated wisdom of previous efforts to balance individual accountability with community welfare. The geography of crime and community response would continue to tell the story of human beings working together to create conditions where all residents could feel safe and supported, where individual problems could be addressed before they became community crises, and where the inevitable conflicts and challenges of urban life could be resolved through cooperation rather than violence. Walking back toward the police station as the afternoon light began to fade, Detective Chun carried with him the understanding that his work was part of a larger, ongoing effort to maintain the social fabric that made community life possible. The city's streets and buildings bore witness to this effort, holding in their accumulated changes the evidence of countless small victories in the patient work of creating conditions where people could live together with mutual respect and support. The geography of his beat would continue to change as new challenges emerged and new solutions were developed, but it would retain the essential character that came from community members' commitment to addressing problems through cooperation and mutual aid rather than through fear and isolation. The streets themselves had become archives of this commitment, preserving in their physical form the memory of human beings choosing again and again to work together in creating communities where safety and freedom could coexist.